It was just a couple of hours before midnight. Some of the 2,200 passengers of a large, luxurious ocean liner were still partying in the beautiful first-class lounges. The rest were asleep in their beds, some of them in spacious cabins filled with paintings and decorated with ornate carvings, others in tiny rooms below sea level. All of these people had only one thing in common. On that chilly April night, all of them were heading from Southampton in England to New York City. The ship was called the Titanic, and at that time, it was considered unsinkable. At the very beginning of the journey, the liner nearly collided with the steamship New York. Luckily, the Titanic managed to pass by the other vessel with several feet to spare. A common sigh of relief escaped the passengers crowding the liner's decks. Little did they know what was awaiting them in the near future. Several days later, when the ship was already in the North Atlantic Ocean, 370 miles away from Newfoundland, the unthinkable happened. At about 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, those who were still awake were knocked over by some mysterious and powerful force. Passengers who were already in their beds got catapulted to the floor. Screams and total confusion. Months before the disaster struck, a ginormous chunk of ice had broken away from a glacier in southwest Greenland. It was made of the snow that had fallen about 100,000 years ago, when mammoths were still roaming the planet. When the iceberg just started its journey, it was a huge thing, almost 1,700 feet long. It also weighed 75 million tons. But then it floated much further to the south than normal, right into the area the Titanic had to cross on its way to North America. Even after melting into the water for months, the iceberg still weighed an impressive 1.5 million tons. Its top part was towering over the water for almost 100 feet. Even so, it looked harmless next to the massive ocean liner, but only at first glance. What people saw was just a tiny part of a jumbo piece of ice. The largest part of any iceberg is hidden under the surface, with a mere 1/10 visible above the water. The Titanic iceberg wasn't an exception. The moment the ship collided with it, the vessel was doomed. Unable to divert its course, it crashed into the ice, rupturing at least 5 of its hull compartments. They immediately started to fill with water, which then flooded each succeeding compartment. The front of the ship started to sink. This raised the back part almost vertically into the air, and then, with a deafening roar, the liner broke in half. The rest is history. But what if what we know about the disaster is not true? What if the ship hadn't been wrecked by an iceberg? What if it had been something more treacherous and way more alive that sank the Titanic? Far, far beneath the surface, in the ocean's dim, dark depths, a shadow lurks. Imagine an enormous creature, round, flat, and full of arms, or rather, powerful tentacles. It resembles a giant squid or octopus, but much, much bigger. Its descriptions go from as long as 10 ships to 1.5 miles long. Rumor has it unlucky sailors sometimes mistake the sea monster for an island, but instead of stepping on dry land, they're dragged down into the ocean. These people meet the Kraken, a legendary creature feared by everyone who sets off on a sea voyage. Usually, the Kraken haunts the seas off the coast of Norway through Iceland and all the way to Greenland. Who knows what has brought the beast further away from home? The waters of the North Atlantic are just as chilly, and the creature feels good and curious. Once it notices the Titanic, the ship has no chances to escape its attention. It's dark. That's why those on the ocean liner don't notice the first alarm bells. The water around the ship starts to bubble. If you strain your ears, you can hear bizarre gurgling sounds. If you strain your eyes, you can see thousands of fish and jellyfish rising to the surface. They feel something's up down below. But even if someone on the Titanic noticed this hectic activity, they wouldn't have time to get out of the way of the horrifying beast. Its enormous size and super long and strong tentacles turn it into a predator you can't escape. A 9-year-old boy standing on the deck knows nothing about the sea monster. He's just watching countless small islands rising out of the sea, very, very slowly. The kid doesn't understand why, but all the blood in his body suddenly runs cold. Hundreds of tiny fish are leaping about in the pools between these sandbanks. But soon, they roll off into the water over the sides of the ginormous something. Several sharp points appear above the surface. The intrigued boy thinks they look like horns. They keep growing, thicker and thicker, the higher they rise. Soon they're towering over the massive Titanic, dwarfing the ship. These horns are the Kraken's dreaded arms. The boy is paralyzed by fear. But then he spots the monster's eye. It's as big as an elephant. It makes the kid come to his senses and dash away, screaming like there's no tomorrow. The boy's shouting attracts people. They gather along the ship's side, trying to spot what scared the child so much. And then they see. First one, then more and more passengers and crew members lean over the railing to get a better look. They aren't being careless, they're just in shock. Indeed, it's hard to believe your eyes when they tell you a dreaded beast is about to attack the ship you're on. Plus, it's dark, and no one can see clearly what that huge shadow is. But the next several minutes prove it's not a mirage. All of a sudden, the creature rises one of its monstrous arms and stretches it toward the vessel. It might very well be longer than the liner's entire hull. Women start screaming and fainting. Men seem to be just as terrified. Those who have managed to keep their heads clear sweep up kids and run for shelter. That's when the first powerful hit shakes the vessel. The Kraken's had enough waiting. It's ready for action. Panic engulfs people on board the Titanic. Running around aimlessly and screaming, they create chaos that makes the beast even more interested. Normally, the monster just wants to be left alone. It rests deep down on the ocean floor, using its long tentacles to tether itself to the bottom and lazily hunt for food. It only rises to the surface when the weather's unusually warm, or when it gets disturbed. The Titanic is probably too massive and loud. It draws the creature out of its slumber. When the beast gets to the surface and sees a large, glistening boat, wow, the thing mesmerizes the creature. It holds out one of its tentacles to touch the unusual construction. The material is hard, and the beast wonders if the thing will break when squeezed. Without wasting much time, it wraps several arms around the ship and tries to squish it. Tiny creatures fussing around, falling overboard, and making annoying high-pitched noises start to irritate the Kraken. It's getting angry. Easing its grip, the monster circles the Titanic several times, getting ready for the next attack. This time, the strike is much stronger. It bends the metal and makes it brittle. One more movement of a deft tentacle, and the ship starts to fill with water. The Kraken retreats, as if to enjoy the results of its efforts. But then, it notices the ship trying to speed up in futile attempts to put some distance between itself and the monster. People on board the Titanic heave a sigh of relief. The beast is nowhere in sight. Little do they know that the Kraken never lets its toys get away. The ship is beginning to slow down. Its rear part is slowly lifting up, and the front is going down underwater. Passengers and crew members are falling over onto the decks. Most of them are too scared to make a sound. That's why everything's happening in almost complete eerie silence. Until the ship breaks into two parts under its own weight. The crash is so powerful that it scares away even the Kraken. Spooked, the beast dives back into the ocean, which creates a massive boiling whirlpool in that spot. The suction is dragging what's left of the Titanic to the depths of the ocean. The most tragic thing here, though, the Kraken isn't even interested in people on board the ship. This creature is content to munch on fish. It doesn't need bigger prey. It's the animal's curiosity that's now pulling the huge ship down to the bottom. Does the majestic liner have any hope? I think you know the answer. The Kraken is a colossal squid, a legendary sea monster, the biggest hunk of calamari you ever saw. And if this monster had existed, the world would have changed beyond recognition. The Kraken has powerful tentacles, solid muscles with suckers at the end. They're just impossible to escape. The Kraken can break a ship in half or just pull it down into the depths. But the worst thing about the Kraken is its size. According to old sailor stories, the Kraken reached 5,000 feet in length. That's almost 10 soccer fields. Hey, maybe the Kraken could play soccer. The Kraken legend said the monster was so giant that sailors mistook it for a small island. In past centuries, it would have been impossible to defeat such a beast. If the Kraken existed in reality, it might have had offspring. Yeah, in all the world's oceans, there would be giant monsters that could sink any ship. It's unlikely that the Kraken would have competitors in its habitat, so its population would grow strongly. Since the Kraken is enormous, it would need lots of food, so the population of other large sea animals would fall significantly. Blue whales, great white sharks, other giant squids, all the big sea creatures would be endangered. Many people are starving because of the reduction of large fish in the ocean. Urban economies that rely on fishing will be in decline. Prices for small fish around the world are getting more expensive because it's unsafe to fish. To defeat the Kraken, you need powerful weapons, but the monster is tough to catch. The Kraken belongs to the cephalopod genus. This species includes squid and octopus, some of the most intelligent creatures on the planet. The Kraken is a skilled hunter and will never fight in the open. So, what can you do? You can't track the Kraken because it approaches from the depths, not the surface. Though you may be able to tell that the monster is somewhere nearby if a lot of fish surface. When the Kraken swims, it scares all the fish in the vicinity. But it might already be too late. A huge tentacle emerges from the water, resembling a high tower. This tower falls on the deck of the ship, shattering it. The sailors scream and run. The Kraken lands a second blow, and the vessel is almost capsized. Next, the Kraken wraps its giant tentacles around the ship and pulls it to the bottom. Oh boy! What if the sailors managed to detach the ship from the tentacles of this monster? With the help of powerful weapons, the ship's crew strikes back. The Kraken retreats under the water. It's hurt, angry. It seems the battle is over, but here comes the worst. A whirlpool forms beside the ship. Thanks to its considerable weight, when the Kraken dives, it creates a whirlpool behind it. Like a drain in a giant bathtub, this whirlpool sucks the ship down. The battle with the Kraken is lost. Well, that was unfortunate. You might be able to defeat the monster if you can anticipate its attack in advance. But the Kraken can see you and your ship before you can see it. Colossal squids live in deep waters, and they have the largest eyes among all animals. The squid's eye is the size of a dinner plate. Thanks to this, they can see their prey from far away. Similarly, a Kraken would spot the ship much sooner than sonar could pick up the Kraken. It would always have the drop on you. Well, that's not good. Around the world, cargo transportation by ship is declining. Airlines provide the only safe connection between the continents. This will increase air pollution. The most successful enemy of the Kraken is submarines. They travel at great depths and are equipped with powerful echolocators to help detect the Kraken in advance. Subs are well armed too, and the round metal body is not so easy to destroy. A single Kraken may be defeated by a submarine, but what if there are several sea monsters? 3 Kraken can wrap their tentacles around the submarine and drag it deeper into the water where the pressure will destroy their enemy. In other words, they'll have a crush on you. The existence of the Kraken will have dramatically changed the development of many countries. What if Christopher Columbus, on his famous journey, noticed an island that he thought was the New World? He approaches it, but tentacles emerge from the island and sink Columbus's ship. The colonization of North America is delayed, maybe until airplanes are invented, and the first crewed flight wasn't until the 20th century. There would be no Hollywood, there would be no hamburgers, no famous American music playing. There wouldn't be YouTube, which means you wouldn't be watching this video right now. Worst of all, the internet wouldn't exist either. And all this because of one stupid monster squid. The Vikings wouldn't sail on their long ships to raid and settle foreign territories. The history of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and other Nordic countries would have changed drastically. Hey, maybe the Titanic wouldn't have hit an iceberg, but a giant sea monster instead. Though it's unlikely that people would take trips on huge ocean liners in a world where the Kraken exists. Maybe though, the Kraken isn't all that aggressive. Still, they need a lot of food, and because of the growing population of these monsters, there will be much less food in the ocean. Therefore, the Kraken will increasingly come to the surface for hunting. In the future, the Kraken will migrate closer to the shore. In many countries, people then are not allowed to swim in the ocean. Imagine floating on the waves and a monster the size of a skyscraper is swimming right below you. Relaxing at sea and on the beach will no longer be popular. Many countries that live off tourism become impoverished. When the Krakens grow hungrier, they try to capture prey from land. A huge squid could attack small port cities. Houses, docks, streets, everything can be crushed. A tremendous amount of plastic is thrown into the ocean near the coasts of large countries. Billions of tons of plastic will bother the Kraken. An angry, hungry monster can attack bridges like the Golden Gate Bridge. Imagine that a huge squid surrounds the bridge and blocks all traffic. Some of these squids could break the strong cables with their power, and the entire structure would collapse into the water. Ooh! It's good that the Kraken doesn't really exist to swim in our seas and oceans, at least as far as we know. But could the monster have actually existed? Legends stretch back years, but scientific evidence appeared in the middle of the 19th century. In 1857, a 3-inch diameter squid beak was discovered on the coast of Denmark. Other huge squid remains were found in the Bahamas, and then scientists were convinced that gigantic squids existed. While colossal squid has been officially discovered since then, it's been more than 100 years, and we still don't know what max size they can grow to. The fact is, colossal squids are one of the most elusive creatures on Earth. They live in the depths of the ocean where it's challenging for scientists to reach. Any dive to a greater depth requires powerful, bulky equipment. Underwater bath escapes and cameras make a lot of noise and light, which squids notice from afar. They flee before we can see them. The legend of the Kraken probably appeared because of a real colossal squid. People in the past didn't know about these creatures' existence, so when they saw one for the first time, they described it as a massive, terrible monster. It's difficult to say if these huge squids were the size of a small island, because the truth is, we've only studied about 5% of the ocean. It may be that in its depths, monsters much more terrible than the Kraken swim. Like my nephew, Peter. You know SOS, don't you? 3 dots, 3 dashes, and 3 more dots. It's an easy enough signal to tap out in Morse code. It means save our souls or save our ship. The crew of the legendary Titanic had been desperately trying to send this signal for 2 hours the night of April 14, 1912. There were other ships not too far from the spot where the iceberg took down the mighty Titan of the sea. But the call for help seemingly disappeared before it could reach them. The passenger ship SS Mount Temple did pick up a signal and try to respond, but the Titanic never got the answer. So what was silencing the ship's cries for help? Some unknown Bermuda Triangle of the North Atlantic? Consider this. Eyewitnesses say the sky was painted with a brilliant aurora borealis that cold, fateful night. Beautiful, yes. But on that day, the northern lights may have sealed Titanic's fate for good. You see, the aurora borealis forms thanks to geomagnetic storms. Sounds complicated, but those are basically fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic sphere. And what causes those is the sun itself. The magnetic sphere is like a protective bubble that surrounds our planet. It blocks harmful solar rays, winds, and other cosmic dangers from reaching us. Without it, life on our planet wouldn't be possible. Earth would look more like Mars. You also have it to thank for compasses pointing north. Experts know the Earth's magnetosphere affects navigational equipment, or disrupts it. Which brings us back to the Titanic. Recently, a published weather researcher named Mila Zenkova proposed a theory that solar flares, which provoked a geomagnetic storm, could have played a major role in the Titanic's untimely demise. Solar flares make themselves known on Earth all the time. Some people are especially sensitive to the magnetic storms they cause. These unlucky folks can feel weakness, fatigue, headaches, and even mood swings. On usual days, the pressure is the same on both sides. The magnetosphere blocks all the bad stuff, and we're all happy. But sometimes explosions occur on the sun. They can be massive, Earth-sized. These flares shoot out a wave of charged particles that collides with the magnetosphere at high speeds. Our protective bubble then goes on the defense. It shrinks, deforms, and pushes those particles toward the poles. Enter those brilliant lights dancing above the Titanic that night. In the north, we know it as Aurora Borealis. In the south, Aurora Australis, or the Southern Lights. When the magnetosphere pushes those solar and cosmic particles toward the poles, they collide with molecules of different gases. That's why you get the range of colors. For example, oxygen can be green or red depending on the distance, and nitrogen is blue or purple. What multiple people saw that night was exactly this phenomenon, including the second officer from the rescue ship Carpathia. He wrote it down in the logbook before getting the distress call from the Titanic. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Auroras are a visible sign of a geomagnetic storm. Now, about navigational equipment. This applies to satellite and radio frequency devices. Remember, they didn't have iPhones back in the Titanic days, so the average person couldn't notice their gadgets going haywire. But navigational devices and wireless telegraph did exist and were actively used. Rewind back to the Middle Ages, when sailors noticed that, on some days, compasses wigged out. The arrows spun in all directions, and people back then had no idea why. It wasn't until the 18th century when French scientists found out that such problematic days occur at the same time as black spots appearing on the sun. Solar flares, the mystery was solved. Now, the Titanic had the most advanced, well-known radio equipment at that time. They tested it thoroughly to make sure it worked for distances up to 2,000 miles away. Titanics passed them all. On April 10, 1912, the massive liner left Southampton and set off for New York. The very next day, the crew started getting the first reports of drifting icebergs and ice fields. They put dots on the map to mark the coordinates and let out a sigh of relief. All the troublesome spots were north of the Titanic's planned route. But after a couple of days, the warnings were moving farther and farther south, encroaching on the majestic ship. On April 14th, Captain Edward Smith decided to change course to the south in hopes of bypassing the ice. This ended up being a huge mistake. Enter the magnetic storm. If it was throwing the navigation equipment off, even by a tiny error of half a degree, the captain could have been mistakenly taking the ship right toward a cluster of icebergs. What's even worse, the radio operators ignored warnings coming from other ships. That, or they simply forgot to hand them over to the captain. As hired contractors from the radio company, they were more interested in transmitting paid telegrams from passengers on that luxurious liner. The radio transmitter kept going out of order that evening, probably because of all this private traffic. When it was finally fixed, operator Jack Phillips received another message from the SS Californian at 10:30 p.m. Their operator was trying to warn Phillips about the coordinates of drifting icebergs, but he paid them no attention. He was nervous and in a hurry. Was the magnetic storm to blame for his frayed nerves and bad mood? We can only speculate. But as you know, some people are more sensitive to these things. The weather was fine, the ocean was calm, the water was smooth as glass. Despite all the warnings, the ship continued to sail at a maximum speed of over 22 knots. An hour later, Titanic collided with the infamous iceberg. On April 15th at 12:14 a.m., in the middle of the night, Titanic's operators started to transmit the first emergency signals. The SS Californian was sailing just 20 miles from the Titanic. They could have easily come to a quick rescue. But 10 minutes before the disaster, the Californian's radio operator had gone to bed. He was the only one who understood Morse code on the ship. According to this new theory, the magnetic anomalies possibly blocked Titanic's messages to other ships. For example, the steamer SS La Providence didn't receive any signals from the sinking ship at all. Yet they were still getting transmissions from another giant, the Olympic, which was 500 miles from the Titanic. That night, the signals were acting strange. They simply got lost somewhere in space, or they were like a jumbled riddle, impossible to solve. The SS Mount Temple did get a message and rushed to Titanic's aid. But as fate would have it, the rescue ship got stuck in ice. She did arrive at Titanic's last known coordinates, but the luxury liner was nowhere to be seen. So were the coordinates accurate at all? The steamer Carpathia was about 60 miles away. At 12:30, their radio operator told the Titanic's crew they were rushing to help. The ship famous for coming to the aid, Carpathia, was going full steam ahead. But here's the odd part. At first, they headed to the wrong spot. The magnetic storm could have thrown its equipment off. Good news is the steamer did end up reaching the right place when they saw the lifeboats full of passengers. Interestingly, once she reached land, the Carpathia didn't have any problems with her equipment. The blackout happened just around the wreckage site. The following investigation blamed radio amateurs for blocking signals. We now might know otherwise. Zinkova explains that at that time, they didn't know exactly how and to what extent the sun influences the Earth. No one could have guessed that the sun could tamper with these massive ships' navigational equipment, especially one that had the best of the best at the time. There's another theory that even the moon could have played a role. Some researchers claim that in January 1912, our natural satellite was closer to the Earth than usual. It caused very strong tides and raised the sea level. Every year, icebergs break away from Greenland and stop around Newfoundland. But not that year. The increased water flow pushed them further for 3 months. And come April, they were right in the way of transatlantic ships. Unfortunately, it was a recipe for disaster when it came to the mighty Titanic. April 12th, in the year 2212. It's a great date for humanity, the 300th anniversary of the launch of the legendary Titanic. The best engineers of the world have collaborated for years to bring their masterpiece to the public, the Space-Tanic, and they've done it just in time. The glorious spaceship is waiting in its harbor under the limelight, photographed by thousands of people. The trip was scheduled for April 12, just like 300 years ago. Finally, the big day has come. The passengers are going on board the most magnificent spaceship of the time. They call it Unbreachable. It has 12 decks, from the third class closer to the bottom, to the most luxurious first class on the top, with panoramic views of outer space. The ship is preparing for launch. The engines are starting, the final countdown has begun, and the Space-Tanic is off into the sky. It quickly becomes no more than a speck in the big blue and then disappears. The first day of the flight goes perfectly. The ship leaves the Earth's atmosphere in less than an hour, and passengers enjoy the wonderful view outside. The blue and green planet on the backdrop of the black void of space. The ship slows down a bit as it moves into orbit. There are too many satellites and space debris circling around the Earth. The Space-Tanic has to go carefully and maneuver around the chunks of metal floating in zero-G. One of them heads straight towards the ship, but it turns on the side burners and moves out of the way just in time. The scrap floats by safely. Finally, the ship is out of the danger zone and into the big black. It turns on the back thrusters to accelerate and heads to the bright side of the moon. It's going to be the first destination of the sightseeing tour. The planet becomes gradually smaller behind, and about halfway to the natural satellite, people on board can marvel at the sight of the sun. The huge ball of burning plasma is bigger and brighter than ever in the cosmic darkness. Suddenly, the ship's captain makes an announcement. All passengers are invited to the promenade decks to watch as the solar panels are being unfolded. People go outside to goggle at the sight. The silver and black panels slowly emerge from their containment slots, and the Space-Tanic finally takes its real form. As the sun's energy begins to flow into the ship, the thrust engines turn to minimum. The spaceship is now in energy collecting mode. For the trip to Mars to take just a few days, it needs to make a transit jump. In another 5 hours, another announcement rings across the board. The ship is approaching the moon, and the passengers are invited to look at the satellite from up close. The Space Titanic passes by at several thousand miles, and the moon looks huge. All the craters on the satellite, even the smallest ones, are clearly visible. The view is outstanding. The moon is left behind, and lights on the ship go dim. There's no natural change of day and night in space, so the crew monitors the time and imitates the shift. The next day promises nothing of interest, as there's going to be a long traverse between the moon and Mars. The passengers are wandering off to their cabins to sleep. The next 2 days go uneventful. On the decks, there are numerous types of entertainment for guests, from gyms and swimming pools to game rooms and dancing halls. People wander around the promenade decks, enjoying the serene views of space. Nothing bodes trouble. On the 4th day, the captain finally announces that the Space Titanic is preparing for the transit jump in 30 minutes. When the time comes, the passengers only feel a slight tug as the huge vessel leaps through space-time, entering the vicinity of Mars. Many passengers go outside to look at the red planet, which is already visible in the dark abyss. The tour is entering its final stage, but the landing is only planned for late night. At 11 p.m., when most passengers were already in their beds, the Space Titanic begins the final maneuvers. It has to make a little roundabout trip over Mars because the port is on the other side of the planet. The flight is nearing its end, only a couple of hours left before landing. The ship is in the orbit on the far side of Mars. Everything's quiet. Too quiet. All of a sudden, an enormous boom thrashes the whole Space Titanic, throwing sleeping people out of their beds. Blinking emergency lights turn on. Everyone's confused, but no announcement comes from the captain. And only those who have been on the starboard side promenade deck notice the horrible detail. The right front wing has been torn off and is zooming past them towards the stern. Pressing their faces to the glass, straining to look at the hull, they see a huge gash near the nose of the ship. The Space Titanic shudders again, and chunks of metal fly out of the gaping hole. The ship rapidly loses pressurization. Meanwhile, the broken-off wing hit the stern and left another gash in it. Mechanisms in the engine compartment start to fall apart and are dragged into space. The ship groans and comes to a halt, suspended thousands of miles above Mars. At last, the captain announces through the intercom that the Space Titanic has unexpectedly collided with a rogue asteroid. All passengers are asked to proceed to their respective decks for evacuation. Within an hour, all rescue capsules are occupied and ready to be deployed, but about a third of the passengers are still on board the ship. It turns out many of the capsules were blown away at the collision. History seems to repeat itself. The captain still orders to deploy the capsules, and they whoosh out of containment tanks, leaving hundreds of people behind. Some left without their family members, not knowing what fate awaits them. The capsules float in space for a few seconds and then turn on their thrust engines, heading to the Martian surface. Another order from the captain: everyone is to go down to their cabins and put on pressurized suits stored under their beds. As the passengers rush to comply, the Space Titanic sends distress signals to Mars and everyone in the vicinity. 100,000 miles away, a large trade ship, Leona, picks up the signal and hurries to help. The creaks and groans on board the Space Titanic become more and more frantic. People are sitting silently in their cabins. It's quiet on board, except for the sounds of the slowly disintegrating ship. And then, suddenly, a loud snap resonates throughout the Space Titanic, and the vessel cracks in two. A gigantic fracture goes from top to bottom, almost perfectly halfway across the decks. Pressurized glass covering the promenade decks shatter into millions of pieces, slowly flying away from the ship. With the decks depressurized, people and things are blown away into outer space. Thankfully, all of the passengers and crew are wearing their suits as ordered, but they only have about an hour before they run out of oxygen. People help each other by floating together and hauling stranded ones to their groups. They can barely control their floating, but somehow they still manage to bring some order to the chaos. Huddled together in orbit above the ominously red planet, they watch as the mighty Titanic turns into a heaping pile of space debris. 45 minutes have passed. The oxygen is running low, and people try to breathe as slowly and carefully as they can. There's still no help in sight, and they're preparing for the worst. But then, one of them starts waving and pointing somewhere. It's a bright spot, hardly different from the stars in far space, but it's getting closer by the second. And within 5 minutes, the relieved people see a spaceship speeding towards them. The Leonas arrive just in time to save the day. Quickly, but without hurry, Leona's crew gather everyone floating in space around the remains of the Titanic and haul them on board their ship. In a few hours, the Leona safely lands at Mars' main spaceport. The newspapers called it the day when the Titanic sank again. When the Titanic began its fateful voyage, it weighed about 52,000 tons. Now, how did they even get it into the water in the first place? Step 1. Find tons of soap and natural fat. Step 2. Dump it all over the ramp in front of the Titanic like a monster slip and slide. They even put grease all over the outside of the ship to make sure it didn't get scratched, dented, or even rip open. Just like that, the Titanic plopped softly into the water, and the workers and owners breathed a sigh of relief. At least that part went well. When they built the Aswan Dam in Egypt, they needed to clear out a huge area for the new artificial lake. Almost 100,000 people had to move out of their homes. That was the easy part. Engineers now had to try to move 2 huge ancient Egyptian temples, or they'd be lost underwater forever. The answer? Thousands of engineers and builders. The temples were built into a mountain, so first they had to detach it using bulldozers and jackhammers. Then they had to take it all apart like a humongous Lego project. Statues, roofs, walls, sculptures, pretty sweet Lego set. Then they cut the temples into bite-sized bits, over 1,000 of them. Each one weighed the same as 3 elephants. So where did they put it all back together? On the same mountain, just 200 feet higher. It took 5 years and about $300 million in today's money. I think even the pharaohs would have been impressed. Now, say you're thirsty, so you grab a glass of water. But where does that water come from? In Saudi Arabia, it comes from salt water. You just need to get the salt out, no biggie. That calls for an evaporator. Saudi Arabia's machine brings fresh water to 300,000 people. Not bad for so much desert. The evaporator weighs 5,000 tons, and it's pretty big, like 10 basketball courts big. They hired a special ship to bring it from Vietnam to Saudi Arabia, but even that was too small. After making the ship a little bigger and making a successful cross-continent journey, the evaporator finally touched down in the Middle East. Then it was easy. Just grab 30 tractor trailers and pull. Pretty impressive, but the largest thing ever moved on Earth is way bigger. Enter the Norwegian Troll gas production platform. It weighs more than the Titanic and is way taller than the Empire State Building. But the engineers weren't scared, even though they had to drag the thing 120 miles from shore. They hooked up 10 powerful boats and pulled it along for a week. That thing cost $1 billion to make, so they had to be careful. The boats were actually pulling it in all directions to keep it steady, then slowly making their way out to sea. Once it got there, its 4 powerful legs were secured with concrete, about as much as you'd use to build 200,000 houses. That part of the sea can be quite rough, so they had to make sure it wouldn't move at all. Natural gas can set on fire, even in the middle of the sea. You gotta move out of town, but you're used to your house, your big kitchen, cozy fireplace. No problem. Take your home with you. About 500 years ago, an Italian architect was constructing the local city's administration building, but the local church bell tower was getting in the way. The solution? Pick up the tower and move it. The architect built a wooden frame around the tower and shifted it using ropes, blocks, and a lot of people power. Since then, a lot of buildings have been moved around, but what happened in China changed everything. In 2004, engineers shifted the Fugang building about 120 feet. It was the heaviest building ever moved, but it only took 11 days. They worked day and night to get it done so fast. 10,000 years ago, a meteorite fell on Greenland. It was the only source of iron for the local people, who started breaking pieces off to make knives, harpoons, arrowheads, and even jewelry. Talk about good luck. Over time, the locals split the meteorite, named Cape York, into a bunch of pieces. Arctic explorer Robert Peary wanted to bring the biggest piece back to the U.S. So, how do you move 30 tons of space rock without trucks or paved roads? Plus, it's 1897 and freezing cold. It took 3 years, but he did it. He ended up building a railway with a special platform to pull it to the nearest shore. It was the first and last railway in Greenland. Perry sold the meteorite for $40,000. Today, that would be about $1 million. In 2012, artist Michael Heiser erected a 340-ton boulder over the entrance to the LA County Museum of Art. It was called Levitating Mass. Installing it was easy. Getting it there, not so much. They had to use a 290-foot trailer and 6 different trucks. They only drove at night 100 miles through 22 cities. The most insane part, it ended up costing $10 million. The Swedish ship Vasa, built about 400 years ago, was almost a celebrity. People were amazed by its size, beautiful decoration, and gold sculptures. First time out to sea, it sank. Why? A gust of wind. Oops. Anyway, about 80 years ago, they decided to pull it out. One plan was to fill it with ping pong balls and freeze it in a block of ice. But instead, they just tied some ropes around it and used 18 lifts to drag it along the seabed to a shallow area. From there, it was pretty easy to lift it out. It was mostly made of wood, not much metal. The ship survived quite well because of the cold seawater and even floated by itself. The shuttle Endeavour flew 25 missions into space, and in 2012, NASA decided it deserved a break. Its retirement home would be the California Science Center. The massive shuttle was loaded onto trailers and driven through LA at the amazing speed of 2 miles per hour. It was the first and probably last time that a spaceship would drive through a big city. They had to clear a pretty big path and ended up chopping down a lot of pesky things like lampposts, traffic lights, power lines, even over 400 trees. But don't worry, they raised a lot of money from the whole thing, enough to plant over 800 new trees. The Statue of Liberty wasn't built in the USA. It was built in France. After 9 years of hard work and a serious amount of copper and iron, she was ready to be given to the United States as a token of friendship. Sending it by mail would take way too much bubble wrap, so they decided to ship it instead. The statue was cut into 350 pieces, loaded into crates, and shipped over to New York. It took them 4 months to assemble all the pieces back together. Talk about Humpty Dumpty. Meet Bagger 288, a self-propelled excavator and the largest land transport on the planet. This beast can shift thousands of cars worth of dirt a day. It finished work in one quarry and had to move on to another. Taking it apart, shipping it, and putting it back together would have been ridiculous. So it just drove over there. It took 3 weeks and only moved at half a mile per hour. To stop it from wrecking everything it drove over, engineers walked ahead, planting grass and covering roads with gravel and dirt. Now, you're walking down the street in France, see a couple of cafes, maybe a nice bakery, and the world's largest gas turbine, named Harriet. Harriet's job? Keep the lights on in over 700,000 French homes. This mammoth turbine weighs as much as 2 jumbo jets and had to travel through France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Hey, let's go Dutch! The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt is made up of more than 2 million huge blocks of stone. No trailers, no tractors, just some good old-fashioned muscle power. Each block weighs more than 2.5 tons. That's like 30 of me. These guys didn't even have strong metals like iron or steel. They mostly used pieces of wood and stone hammers. May 31st, 1911. The second Olympic-class liner is finally complete after 2 years of construction. It'll be ready for its first voyage a year later. It's the most luxurious ship in the world. They call it Titanic. You just read the groundbreaking news in the Daily Herald and decide to treat yourself to a trip on this floating gem. You head over to the White Star Line's headquarters in London to buy yourself a ticket. You get the cheapest first-class fare for £30. That would be over $4,500 today. Wednesday, April 10th, 1912. The day is finally here. You must be in Southampton at 9:30 a.m. The third-class passengers board the ship first. Then the second and first classes follow an hour before the vessel sets sail. Stewards on board welcome everyone and show them to their cabins. Now it's your turn. The majestic ship in front of you is bigger than you imagined. As you board the Titanic, Captain Edward Smith himself greets you. Your trip will begin shortly. By the time the liner stops at Cherbourg in Queenstown, over 2,200 passengers and crew will be on board, embarking on their transatlantic trip. The Titanic is ready to sail, and you hear the horns from the deck as you wave goodbye to the people below. But just a few minutes later, you hear panic rising on the deck. You run up to the railings to see what's going on. It's another ship coming too close. The side of it says SS City of New York. Titanic has barely left the dock, but it looks like there's about to be a collision. The captain manages to steer clear of the other ship within just a few feet. Phew, that was close. The ship is scheduled to arrive in New York a week later on April 17th, but that's only if things go according to plan. The weather is clear until Sunday the 14th. As the vessel crosses a cold front, it encounters huge waves and strong winds. That night is quiet but cold. The Titanic starts getting warnings from other ships about drifting blocks of ice in the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. But this time, the great ship doesn't continue to travel at full speed. Instead, the captain slows her down. He wants to make sure the lookouts will have plenty of time to spot any icebergs along the way, even if it means arriving in New York behind schedule. It's 11:40 in the evening. Lookout Frederick Fleet spots a colossal iceberg right ahead. He immediately alerts the bridge. The first officer tells the steersman to go around the iceberg, and the rest of the crew members must stop the engines right away. Everyone on board is working together to avoid the obstacle. But in this story, the steersman doesn't panic. He immediately turns the wheel the right direction away from the iceberg. Many passengers have already been awoken by the commotion and jostling. Some go on the deck in their nightgowns and pajamas to see what's going on. A few peek over the right side of the ship to get a closer look. You and everyone else watch anxiously with white-knuckle grips on the railing. The stress and cold make you shiver. You can't help but wonder if the Titanic will collide with the iceberg. It's getting closer and closer. Onlookers hold their breath. It's so quiet you could hear a pin drop. And then, within a mere inch, the ship slowly sails by the ice monster. There was no contact, no gap ripped in the hull hundreds of feet long that would allow water to flood into the lower compartments. Everyone starts clapping and hugging each other. After doing all the necessary checks, the captain officially announces that everything is all right. He invites the passengers on the deck to come inside for a hot cup of tea before they go back to their cabins. You follow the group and see the captain leaving to go report the incident. He also alerts other ships in the North Atlantic to slow down and be on the lookout. Amongst those ships is the Carpathia. Nope, she continues on her course. No need to come to Titanic's rescue tonight. RMS Titanic finally reaches its destination on April 17, 1912. It's 8 hours late, but it's safe. Thousands of people come to the New York docks to admire the most luxurious ship in the world. It had a successful first voyage. Before getting off the ship, some passengers exchange addresses to write letters to each other, like tennis players Richard Norris and Carl Baer. Both were on board the Titanic, but this time, Norris didn't spend hours in the cold water of the North Atlantic trying to help other passengers, almost losing his legs to hypothermia. And Baer was never on a lifeboat with his girlfriend, where he asked her to marry him. No, this time, he did it with friends and family around, and they all celebrated the engagement. The two tennis players end up playing their first match together later in 1912. Norris became one of the best players of his generation and won the Davis Cup 5 times. Margaret Brown was going back to the U.S. to see her sick grandchild. This time, she didn't have to help passengers get on lifeboats and never got on Lifeboat 6 herself. When Brown gets off the ship, she runs to her grandson's side. This time, she never met the crew or the captain of the Carpathia to give them an honorary silver cup. She kept doing philanthropic work, but she never became known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Violet Jessup never liked the idea of sailing in the North Atlantic because she knew how bad the weather could be. She was cautious, having just survived a crash a few months earlier. It was on the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. But her friends convinced her to join the legendary ship's crew. This time, she was never called on deck to help passengers and never boarded Lifeboat 16. She continued working on the Titanic until her retirement, meaning she was never taken on as a nurse of the Britannic, and in November 1915, it didn't become the third shipwreck Jessup would survive. Bandmaster Wallace Hartley went on the voyage to make new possible contacts for future work, but he kept playing to entertain passengers. This time, he never played music to a panicked crowd of people while the ship was sinking. He survives. He goes home to his fiancée, gets married, and starts a family. He continues entertaining people on the North Atlantic run. This time, his mourning fiancée never received his violin, and the historic Titanic memorabilia was never sold in 2013 for $1.7 million. Bertha Main met the love of her life, Quig Baxter, in Brussels while he was traveling with his mother and sister. Baxter wanted to take Main with him, so he secretly booked her a cabin under the name Mrs. de Villiers. This time, he never had to guide his family to a lifeboat. His family met his girlfriend when they got off the ship, not on Lifeboat 6. This time, Baxter survived. He returned to Canada with his girlfriend, and she never went back to Europe alone. Main's nephew would never find a shoebox in her closet with memories from the Titanic. Dorothy Gibson was playing bridge that night with a couple of New York bankers. When she went back to her stateroom with her mother, she never heard that long, sickening crunch and never got on Lifeboat 7. And in May 1912, she doesn't star in a movie about surviving the Titanic because there was no crash to survive. She went on to do great things, and she eventually moved to France with her mom. In this hypothetical story, the Titanic went on to have a successful career. It was the most luxurious ship for many years to come. It did the North Atlantic run countless times, and it successfully delivered passengers and mail where they needed to go. After 25 years in service, the old liner was scrapped. Another large vessel replaced it. It had more room for lifeboats and a large enough deck for people to walk and play. The White Star Line Company would eventually merge with their competitors. But this time, because their ships didn't sink, they made enough profit to continue going strong. In 1980, the company would become a major airline. Their first trip was from Dublin to New York. The plane was nicknamed Titanic in honor of the airline's historic ship. And this time, in 1985, the only thing oceanographers find at the bottom of the North Atlantic is corals, fish, and mollusks. And a rather large blue diamond necklace. Hold on. Nah, just some broken blue glass. Never mind.
The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" The Titanic strikes the ice. Water starts flooding in. Third-class passengers are locked up. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Panic sets in. Violins are playing. The ship sinks. Well, we all know the story of the movie Titanic like the back of our hand by now. But what if I told you that Hollywood lied to us? To tell the real story of what happened that freezing night in 1912, we need to rewind a bit. The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" Yep, that part was true. Just before 11:40 at night, Frederick Fleet noticed something darker than the sea directly ahead. As the ship got closer, he realized it was an iceberg. The engines were quickly reversed and the ship turned sharply. Instead of hitting it head-on, Titanic scraped along the side of the berg, sprinkling ice on the forward deck. If you remember, in the movie, Jack and Rose are having a romantic moment when they feel the ship shudder after hitting the iceberg. Everything shakes as if they were in the middle of a light earthquake. Some real-life passengers reported feeling something similar after the impact, but according to Titanic survivor Frank Prentice, it wasn't exactly like that. He said there was no impact as such, and it all felt more like slamming on your car brakes. The ship stopped, and that was that. Some people even slept right through the collision, confirming that there wasn't such an abrupt impact. Mr. Prentice, curious about what had happened, left his cabin and went out to the deck. When he got there, all he could see was a little ice on the surface, not the towering iceberg that Jack and Rose saw. But as we all know by now, the real damage happened below the waterline, where the iceberg had a jagged spur that slashed a 300-foot gash in Titanic's hull. Once the crew realized how severe the damage was, they immediately began sending distress calls to nearby ships, asking for help. At some point in the movie, the radio operator goes to the captain and says there is only one ship nearby, the RMS Carpathia, which later ends up rescuing many passengers. But in real life, there were more ships around. It's believed that the SS Californian was only about 23 miles away. This ship might have actually seen the Titanic sinking, or at the very least, seen its rockets exploding high in the sky. Yet, for reasons we will never fully understand, they didn't try to help. Let's get back to the story. Now, people need to get off the ship. At 12:45, lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered. Just like in the movie, women and children were told to go first. But in reality, some women were hesitant and even refused to get into the lifeboats. Mr. Prentice said this happened mainly for two reasons. First, these lifeboats were high and passengers were terrified of the 70-foot drop from the deck to the ocean below. And second, most women didn't believe the Titanic would actually sink. It was called unsinkable after all. So the idea of getting into a lifeboat seemed pointless at the time. This mindset probably explains why Eloise Smith, a first-class passenger, recalled that there was no panic or chaos at first. Other survivors backed this up, saying that no women or kids were crying. But one thing that was indeed concerning, at least for the crew, was the possibility that the lifeboats might buckle under too much weight. This is one of the theories why the first few lifeboats left carrying only a fraction of their full capacity. Like lifeboat number 7, which only carried 27 people in it, even though it could hold up to 65. In total, Titanic had 20 lifeboats, which could carry about half of the 2,200 people on board that night. But that didn't happen. And now we know the passengers had no idea there weren't enough for everyone. As women were calmly getting into the first lifeboats, musicians headed up to the deck. Their only goal was to play and keep the passengers calm. That's a pretty well-known fact. But the real story is that some survivors said they never saw or heard the band. No violinists whatsoever. It's not like Hollywood misled you though. The musicians did play for over 2 hours after the ship had hit the iceberg. So maybe these passengers were just too panicked to notice the songs, or the musicians started playing later than we think. Now, it's time to talk about the terrible treatment that third-class passengers received. The movie portrayed the crew as cruel, locking the less fortunate below deck like animals, giving them no chance to reach the lifeboats and save their lives. But the official inquiry into the disaster suggested that wasn't true. I mean, yes, fewer third-class passengers survived compared to those in first and second class, but there were other factors at play. Many third-class passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, clinging to their belongings, and had a harder time making their way up from the cabins, which were at extreme ends of the ship. Some survivors confirmed that they were not locked up. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Mrs. George Wabi, a Lebanese woman traveling in third class, said that when chaos had erupted, some brave crew members and well-dressed first-class passengers had actually helped her get up to the first-class deck and eventually onto a lifeboat. At first, the Titanic was sinking slowly, bit by bit. Passengers reported seeing the water rising and hearing pops and cracks. Then, there was a loud boom. Some said there had been just one explosion, while others described it as a series of smaller explosions, which they'd thought had been the bulkheads giving way. And there's also a group of people who said they had only heard a rumbling sound. So not everyone agreed on the sound they had heard, but one thing is a fact. By 2:18 in the morning, the lights on Titanic went out, and the ship plunged into complete darkness. As the bow continued sinking, the stern rose out of the water, putting immense pressure on the middle of the ship. This caused the Titanic to break in two. In James Cameron's movie, this moment is pretty dramatic, with the ship sinking almost straight down into the water. But in reality, the break probably happened at a much lower angle, likely just below the waterline. Even so, it tilted enough that people couldn't stay on their feet and started sliding into the water. One interesting thing is that it wasn't until the wreckage was found in 1985 that it was finally confirmed the Titanic had broken apart. Up until then, survivors had given conflicting stories. At least 8 survivors claimed they had seen the ship split. Emily Ryerson, a first-class passenger, described it as if the Titanic had been sliced in half with a knife. But there was also a small number of witnesses that insisted Titanic had gone down intact. At the time, this theory was more accepted because most people still didn't believe that the supposedly indestructible ship could break in half. So why the conflicting reports? Okay, so what you don't see in the movies, for obvious reasons, is how incredibly dark it was when the tragedy happened. It was like being in a room with no light, where you can only make out shapes and shadows. That's what it was like on the lifeboats. This means passengers couldn't really see what was happening, and most of those who were close to the ship either lost their lives or were too focused on trying to survive to pay attention to the details of the wreck. Although James Cameron's film didn't fully capture how terrifyingly dark the disaster truly was, the 2012 TV series Titanic did a better job of showing the pitch-black horror of that night. Even then, the reality was much darker and more terrifying than either of these two productions could portray.
The unsinkable Titanic didn't go down peacefully, which made finding its final resting place all the more difficult. The world-famous RMS Titanic sank in 1912, but was only discovered in 1985 on a secret mission. Although people back in the early 1900s had the approximate location of where the Titanic was, they didn't have the right technology to find it. As it went under, the ship sent several CQD signals, standing for Come Quickly, Distress, to a nearby ship named Carpathia. Come at once, we have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man, were some of the final words transmitted from the Marconi wireless on the ship. These Morse code messages were also what made the first research missions to the wreck possible. RMS Carpathia found the lifeboats filled with Titanic survivors, but the world also desperately wanted to see what became of the famous liner. Fast forward to 1953. That's when the first serious attempt to find the Titanic wreck happened. A man named Risdon Beasley tried using a loud eruptive device to locate the ship. It sounds weird, but there's science to back it up. When dynamite goes off, The waves from the detonation hit the bottom of the ocean floor. With the help of sonars, scientists would be able to locate if there was anything solid at the bottom of the ocean. But Beasley had no luck. Another 20 years would pass before oceanographer Robert Ballard would make his attempt to locate the Titanic. Ballard had a bit more luck than Beasley. Over the previous years, underwater technology had gotten more funding and so worked much better. He tried it the first time in 1977. Ballard partnered with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on a mission to map the ocean floor. While the institute hired him to test out their new mapping technology, Ballard's intention was to go a little further and find the Titanic wreck. In the middle of this new technological ship, there was a hole that allowed for a long pipe to be extended into the water just above the ocean floor. Attached to the end of this pipe, Ballard installed a pod with sonars and cameras. They thought they were in for something big, and so they took the ship to sea to run some tests. That's when, on a trial run, adversity struck. The drill pipe broke, sending all of their expensive material to the bottom of the ocean floor, just like the Titanic. When Ballard failed, another important character came into this story, a man named Jack Grimm, an eccentric oil tycoon. Grimm had become famous for trying to find things such as Noah's Ark, the Loch Ness Monster, and Bigfoot. He also tried to prove the hollow Earth theory that says that the interior of Earth is entirely hollow and hosts underground cities and nations. His search consisted of trying to find a large hole on the North Pole and thus venturing inside the hollow Earth. After his attempts failed, he set his eyes on the jewel liner that had sunk, the RMS Titanic. Grimm had the money, but he didn't have the know-how. So, as a billionaire, he made a big donation to Columbia University and asked in return to use some of their equipment. He hired a team of highly qualified scientists to help operate the machinery. Here's where it gets a little strange. Jack Grimm was a believer in folklore and non-conventional ways of doing things. So he brought a monkey on board and surprised the research team. This monkey, called Titan, was believed to point to a map and locate lost things. In this case, the Titanic. The scientists went crazy when the monkey appeared and told Grimm it was either them or the monkey. This expedition left Florida without Titan. Yes, there would be no monkey business. They set the course to the exact location of Titanic's last distress signal. They arrived, examined every inch of the ocean floor, but still found nothing. Grimm's first expedition lasted 3 weeks, but unfortunately, they found absolutely nothing. They tried a particularly good search method known as mowing the lawn, where they mimic such movements to map every inch of a larger area around Titanic's distress coordinates. The reasons for failure were important defects in the equipment and terrible weather. That's when that prior searcher of the lost Titanic came back into the picture, Robert Ballard. He didn't have the millions Jack Grimm had, but he had one thing going for him. The marine geologist was working closely with the U.S. Navy to locate 2 nuclear submarines which had sunk in the 1960s. Ballard himself says he was living 2 lives, one as a researcher and the other as a Navy intelligence officer. The deal was simple. He'd have a green light to search for the Titanic after he found the 2 missing submarines. To find Thresher and Scorpion, he used an unmanned submarine vehicle called Argo. Argo was like a little snow sled. It was attached to a bigger ship that sailed above the water. Argo was connected to the ship by a long cable, and it was piloted by a team on board. The sled had sonars and cameras that provided real-time imaging of the ocean floor, so it was a real advancement on other attempts. After much thinking, he had a eureka moment. He supposed the force of the wreck should have left a comet trail that led back to the ship. While searching for the Titanic, most people had tried to find the ship itself. But until then, it had been trying to find a needle in a haystack. That's why Ballard's logic was so brilliant. He needed to invert the order. He had another obstacle on his hands: time. He could only look for the ship after finding the lost subs, and by the time that happened, he had 12 days left. He teamed up with another scientist, and they applied the mowing the lawn method to map the ocean bed. Another important piece of information that most researchers left out was that there was a sea current moving south on the day of the disaster. This meant that the debris field should be south of the distress signal coordinates. To save time and resources, he would do a quick reconnaissance of the ocean floor, spacing lines more than 3 miles apart to look for debris fields. He also relied more on the camera visuals than on the sonar signals. His team took turns piloting Argo and watching the video. Days rolled by, with nothing but the empty ocean floor showing up. Until the rocks they were used to seeing started to look like man-made debris. Suddenly, there it was, the Titanic's boiler. Ballard was right. The debris field would take them back to the ship. After 73 years of searching, they had finally found the Titanic wreck. In the Titanic movie, you won't see any fumes above the fourth funnel of the legendary ocean liner, and it's not a mistake. Back in 1911, the year before the Dream ship's departure, large ships would mostly sail with 4 chimneys. They needed those to draw heat and fumes from their massive boilers. The Titanic was a real engineering gem that only needed 3 chimneys to function. So the fourth was added for balance and more impressive looks. The White Star Line thought the public would have been disappointed to see only 3 pipes on the greatest ship of all time. The Titanic's sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic, also had 1 fake funnel each for the same reason. The dummy chimney wasn't completely useless and served for ventilation. It took out the fumes from the machine spaces in the lower decks and from one of the first-class general rooms. 1 big ventilation funnel, instead of several small ones, helped to declutter the upper decks and left more open space for passengers to enjoy their strolls. When Titanic went down, the funnels, each weighing 60 tons, went down with the rest of the ship. They were made extra tall to make sure the passengers weren't covered in the suit being ejected. Their height and weight let them stay in the upright position. The forward funnel, followed by the others, fell only when the ship went for the final dive. Those chimneys were much lighter than the bow, so they spread among other debris. The light material they were made of flattened once it hit the bottom, and the iron-eating bacteria living deep down took care of it later. The bow of Titanic remained intact when it hit the seabed, but the stern was completely mangled. When the famous ocean liner hit that iceberg, things got really messy. It took the future movie star a whole 2 hours and 40 minutes to submerge completely. The collision let water flood 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. As the water gushed into the starboard side, the ship started to tilt down in the front and a bit to the right. By midnight, the damaged compartments were spilling water into others, and it was chaos because these compartments were only watertight horizontally. Soon enough, water started flooding through the anchor chain holes, and by 2 a.m., the bow was sinking, and the stern's propellers were lifted out of the water. The ship kept flooding until the moment the bow went underwater, and the stern shot up almost 45 degrees. The weight of those massive propellers stressed the ship's midsection. The steel just couldn't handle it and failed. Survivors described that moment as some loud noise, like breaking china or falling gear. That was the Titanic's upper structure giving in. By 12 past 2 a.m., the bow and stern were only connected by the inner bottom structure. Minutes later, the bow, weighing almost 16,000 tons, broke loose from the stern. The stern rose sharply to an almost vertical position and started sinking slowly. By 2:20, it disappeared underwater. The bow was cruising down at about 13 miles per hour and had hit the ocean floor almost a half an hour before the stern. The 2 parts of the Titanic now lie 2,000 feet apart, pointing in different directions. The bow remained mostly intact, just covered in mud. The stern turned into a tangled wreck because of the implosions it went through during the descent. The air trapped within the structure just couldn't handle the increasing pressure of the water deep down. Signal rockets played a big part in the Titanic's tragedy. When a ship goes down, you're supposed to shoot up red flares to signal trouble. But someone decided to stock Titanic with white lights instead of the usual red ones. So when the ship smacked into that iceberg, the crew fired off white flares. The SS Californian was passing nearby, and his captain knew the Titanic was in a dangerous iceberg zone. The crew didn't spot the sinking Titanic, but they sure saw those white rockets. The radio between the ships was useless because the Californian's operator switched it off. The captain had a gut feeling something was off, so he flashed a Morse code light signal at Titanic. But he received no reply because the Titanic had already gone underwater. There was another ship, Samson, sailing alongside the Titanic. It had plenty of illegally hunted frozen seal meat from Canadian waters abroad, so it was sailing with lights off to remain unnoticed. When they saw the Titanic's white rockets, they thought it was the Coast Guard and zoomed away. Samson didn't have a radio, so they couldn't find out about the ongoing disaster. The crew got the news about Titanic only when they got to the coast of Iceland the following month. There have been many theories to explain the Titanic tragedy, and one of the recent ones says that there was a fire involved. An Irish journalist went full detective for decades, digging into the mystery, and stumbled upon a game-changer. He came across a photo album that had been hiding from the public for a century after the tragedy. In the pictures, taken at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland, just over a week before the liner sailed, you can clearly see a massive 30-foot black spot on the ship's hull. Maloney researched the photos and eyewitness testimony from the time and claimed that a fire spontaneously broke out inside of one of Titanic's enormous coal bunkers. It was raging for a whole 3 weeks and messed with the metal, critically weakening a crucial segment of the ship's hull. Back then, most ships had just one hull, so it was the only skin the Titanic had. That's why the iceberg managed to punch a hole through the ship so easily. If it hadn't been for the fire, the Titanic might have shrugged off that iceberg collision. The company operating the liner knew about the fire, but they decided to conceal that fact. They didn't want any negative stories in the press as they faced some serious competition in transatlantic voyages. The Titanic was sold out, so they stocked up on coal and made it sail. The moon might have also played a role in the sinking. Our satellite heavily affects tides on the Earth. The closer it is to our planet, the stronger the tides are because of the increasing gravity of the moon. Back in 1912, the moon was so close it made several glaciers in Greenland break apart. Massive chunks of ice that broke off from the glaciers started floating south. The supermoon event came just 6 minutes after a spring tide. During new and full moons, the alignment of the moon, the Earth, and the Sun makes their combined gravity reach its peak. And the day before, our planet had come the closest to the Sun that year, which made the gravity even stronger. This mixture of events created perfect conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. It created the perfect conditions for the icebergs breaking off from Greenland's glaciers to move freely. Opponents of this theory say that the difference in tidal force wasn't actually that big, and it couldn't have been the main cause of the sinking. The iceberg tore down the side of the ship, leaving a huge opening in the hull. It wasn't a continuous rip, and damage was caused in several places. Some experts believe the ship would have survived the iceberg if it had hit head-on. The Titanic had watertight compartments designed to prevent flooding in case of a collision. Only the first 3 or 4 of these compartments would have been flooded. This could have helped save a lot of lives. Supporters of this theory put the blame for the disaster on First Officer William Murdoch. Huge, fast-moving ships don't just turn in a matter of seconds like a speeding car. It takes minutes. When Murdoch realized the collision was inevitable, he tried dodging left to avoid a direct hit. But despite his efforts, the ship still collided with the iceberg. You know the rest. It seems like we all cried watching the heartbreaking goodbye of Jack and Rose from the Titanic. Oops, spoiler, sorry. But the real-life stories from the sinking of the famous ship were no less touching. Joseph LaRoche was born in 1886 in Haiti to a wealthy family. He was growing up without a dad, but his mother was a self-made woman and a respected merchant. His uncle was the head of his country. Joseph was fluent in French, Creole, and English. At the age of 15, Joseph realized he wanted to become an engineer. There were no engineering schools in Haiti, so he moved to France to get his education. The journey took him a whopping 83 days. Still, in his student years, Joseph met Juliet in a suburb of Paris through a mentor. They soon became friends, and then it grew into something bigger. The couple decided to get married. There was only one problem. Joseph couldn't find a well-paid qualified job even after completing his studies because of racial discrimination. The intelligent young man realized he could do better. Plus, he needed to provide for his growing family. His third kid was on the way. His uncle back in Haiti promised he'd help Joseph secure a job as a mathematics professor. His mother was overjoyed that her son and his family would be living in Haiti. She bought them first-class tickets for the French liner La France as a reunion gift. But that liner had really weird rules separating parents from their offspring for meals. The LaRoches didn't want to leave their youngsters and make them feel sad on a trip across the ocean. So they decided to trade their first-class tickets for La France for second-class tickets for RMS Titanic's maiden voyage. The Titanic was all the hype, and it didn't separate families, so it looked like a great deal. They planned to change for another ship in New York that would take them straight to their final destination in Haiti. The family boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912, at Cherbourg. They had 3 days to enjoy the luxurious staterooms, a dining salon, a library, and 3 outdoor promenade decks available to second-class passengers. Juliet sent a letter to her father from Titanic's final stop in Queenston, Ireland. She told him they were more than happy with the accommodation. They had 2 bunks in their cabin and a couch that converted into a bed for their youngest family members. The family made friends with some nice co-passengers with whom they had traveled together from Paris. She thought they had been the only other French people on board, so they sat together for meals. Juliet mentioned they had all spent time together on the deck of the liner. She also wrote the people on board were friendly, although some sources say the family had gone through quite a lot of mean stares, gossip, and remarks. On the night of April 14th, their exciting journey came to an abrupt end. Even though Titanic's wireless operators had received warnings about drifting ice from nearby ships, the liner continued to plow ahead at full throttle. It was around 11:40 p.m. when Titanic's hull collided with the iceberg around 370 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The practically unsinkable ship was severely under-equipped with lifeboats, enough for only about half of its 2,200 passengers. The nearest rescue ship, the Carpathia, was too far away to help. A steward woke up the LaRoche family and took them to the lifeboats, as Juliet remembered later. She couldn't speak any English, so everything that was going on seemed even scarier to her. A little after midnight, the crew received the order to give priority to women and children when boarding the lifeboats. Juliet later remembered a terrible panic had begun, as people had been pushing each other to get to the desired seat. At some point, she felt they had pulled away her older daughter and thrown her into the abyss. A moment later, she had joined her Simone in the same emptiness. So, pregnant Juliet and her 2 daughters got spots in Lifeboat 14. But they had to say goodbye to Joseph as the boat was being lowered into the sea. He wrapped his coat around Juliet, saying she'd need it, and promised to get in another lifeboat and see her and the little ones again in New York. The 25-year-old Joseph LaRoche didn't manage to stay true to his word. In a couple of hours, Titanic sank underwater, taking the lives of almost 1,500 people. Joseph was one of them. Juliet and the girls were among the 700 survivors who had been rescued by the Cunard liner Carpathia several hours later. Once they reached New York, they were looking through the crowds of people, hoping to see Joseph again. When it became obvious they wouldn't find him, it was time for them to decide what to do and where to go. Without any knowledge of English or money that had gone down with the ship, Juliet managed to survive in America only for 3 weeks, and then had no other choice but to go back to France. Joseph's uncle was no longer able to help them, as others had taken his life 4 months after the Titanic tragedy. In December 1912, Juliet gave birth to a son who she named Joseph after his father. For the rest of her life, she couldn't get over the loss of her beloved husband. That's why she didn't like to speak about what had happened on Titanic, and told her children not to mention it. In 1995, a member of the Titanic Historical Society interviewed Louise, who was the last remaining LaRoche child and the last French survivor of the sinking. And that's when the world first heard about this heartbreaking story. It inspired some plays and articles, but it never got the same attention as the story of other passengers. You probably remember the elderly couple going down together in their bed on the Titanic. It was inspired by Isidor and Ida Strauss. They were both born in Germany and emigrated to the United States as kids. They met in New York and got married 5 years later. Isidor started a china and porcelain business with his brother that grew into the glassware department at Macy's and turned them into multimillionaires. Isidor and Ida were well known in New York, not only for their wealth and charity, but also for their love and devotion to each other. In 1912, the couple decided to run away from the New York winters and headed for Europe. By that time, they'd already been married for 40 years. In early April, it was time for them to sail back home to New York. They normally traveled on huge German liners, but at that time, they couldn't resist the hype of everyone talking about that new luxury liner, the RMS Titanic. That's how they ended up in one of the first-class private suites at the top of the ship. The Strauss couple spent their evenings dining in front of a live orchestra in a hall filled with fancy furniture and expensive wooden paneling. On the night of April 14th, they felt a slight tremor and then left their private suite and waited for instructions from the crew. They told the passengers not to lose their passes, as they'd need them when everyone got back on board. But the ship was going under. The Strauss couple were standing next to Lifeboat 8. Mr. Strauss, who was 67 at the time, was offered a seat with his wife because of his age. He refused it, saying he was not too old to sacrifice himself for a woman. He wanted to wait and make sure no women and kids were left behind. Ellen Bird, Ida's maid, hesitated before getting on the lifeboat, but Ida told her to go. She took the easy decision not to leave her husband on the sinking ship. Ida took off her beautiful mink coat and handed it to her shivering maid, saying she wouldn't be needing it anymore. Isidor didn't manage to convince her to save herself, so they stayed together till the end. Some of the surviving first-class passengers later remembered they had seen the couple standing peacefully on the deck, holding hands, just waiting.
Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, but not many people know that Titanic had two sister ships, and that on the night of its sinking, one of them was rushing to help but didn't make it in time. Bad luck seemed to follow the trio of ships, but each one of them had glorious moments that live in the minds of those who sailed in them. Keep on watching to discover a story of awe, ingenuity, and ill fate. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and turn notifications on to join us on the bright side of life. You know how the iceberg hit the Titanic, how the band played to the end, and how the whole tragedy unfolded, but before it happened, it would have seemed an impossibility for such a ship to meet the end it did. None of that could have been foreseen by White Star Line, the company who built the Titanic, who had high hopes for what the unsinkable ship and its sister ships, the Britannic and the Olympic, would accomplish. The Olympic was the first of the trio to make sail on June 11, 1911, heading towards New York. The sheer size of it would wow the crowds. The Olympic's maiden voyage went without incident, and a crowd of 8,000 people in New York got to explore its luxurious accommodations while it was docked there. There were high expectations for the massive ship, but just around 2 months later, the Olympic crashed with the HMS Hawke. The Hawke got the brunt of the damage, as the bow was left flat as a pancake. After the crash, the Olympic made its way slowly back to Belfast, where the Titanic was being constructed. On the dock, people could see the two enormous ships side by side, as parts of the Titanic were used to put the Olympic back in shape. A rare sight to behold. And on April 14, 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg, and minutes later, the crew radioed nearby ships for help. That night, the Olympic was returning from New York when it received the distress signal. The ship turned around and rushed at full speed towards the Titanic, but they were so far away that they would have arrived next night. At some point during the early hours of April 15, 1912, the crew of the Olympic decided they wouldn't make it in time and stopped course. the survivors of the Titanic were eventually rescued by the Carpathia. Olympic was set up with lifeboats for all crew and passengers after the Titanic sank. It went from having 20 lifeboats to 64. Changes were also made to the watertight bulkheads, and an extra hull to construct a type of double hull was installed. It was determined that a double hull would have kept the Titanic from sinking. For several years, Olympic was used in the war effort against Germany. Throughout the years, Olympic carried over 200,000 passengers, which included thousands of Americans fleeing from Europe and troops battling during World War I. One of the most significant moments for this ship was when it struck a German submarine and sank it. It was discovered that the submarine was preparing to fire a torpedo on the Olympic before Olympic rammed it. The Olympic ended up sailing the seas for 3 decades, which earned her the nickname of the Old Reliable, despite some previous accidents. It went on to help the survivors on the HMS Audacious when it was sinking, and do what it couldn't for its sister, Titanic. Eventually, bad luck caught up with the Olympic. The ship crashed with the Nantucket Lightship, and the crash signaled the beginning of the end. Beaten up, and after years of service, the Olympic was demolished and scrapped for parts. The Old Reliable saw many years of service and thousands of passengers, but the Britannic's journey was shorter-lived. When the Titanic sank, White Star Line was faced with a problem since they already had another enormous ship in the works. White Star Line began construction on the HMHS Britannic on November 30th, 1911, around 4 months before the Titanic sank. Although the Britannic was the youngest of the trio of ships, having been constructed last, it was also the biggest. They intended to name it Gigantic, but after the Titanic's disaster, they changed the name to Britannic, since they considered it to be a lucky name. With the Titanic sinking, the White Star Line underwent rigorous investigation, and many changes were made to the Britannic's design. The Britannic looked very similar to the Titanic, and it had what was at the time the largest marine turbine in the world, able to reach faster speeds than the Olympic. With Titanic's fate fresh in their minds, everything possible was done to ensure the safety of this newer ship. The Britannic was eventually launched on February 26, 1914, almost 2 years after Titanic met its end. After the Titanic's disaster, the White Star Line wanted the Britannic to redeem their name. The Britannic was on its way to becoming a successful ship. It transported passengers for over a year and a half when the British government requisitioned it and turned it into a hospital ship during the beginning of World War I. The ship became an even more impressive sight to look at. It was painted all white, with enormous red crosses on its side to indicate it was a hospital ship. One of the ship's surgeons, Dr. J.T.H. Beaumont, thought of it as the most wonderful hospital ship that ever sailed the seas. It could treat as many as 3,309 patients at once. This is how the Britannic became His Majesty's Hospital Ship, or HMHS Britannic. Though the sight of this magnificent ship must have put a smile on a wounded soldier's face or two, the Britannic didn't operate for long. Just a year after it was turned into a hospital ship, the Britannic was making its way through the Aegean Sea to pick up wounded soldiers, when it was struck by a loud explosion. The passengers didn't know what had happened, but headed to the deck to disembark. It is unclear what hit the Britannic, but the general consensus is that it was struck by a mine left by a German U-boat, though some still believe a torpedo hit it. The captain tried to move the ship to a beach close by, but the ship was sinking fast. In the desperation, against the captain's orders, several crew members launched lifeboats and disembarked. But since the ship was moving and the propellers working, the lifeboats were sucked and destroyed by the propellers. Though so much effort had gone in to ensure the Britannic was safer than the Titanic, whatever explosion occurred left the Britannic in the same dire condition as the Titanic in just 10 minutes. In a cruel twist of fate, it also sank in the ocean. Unlike Titanic's enormous death toll, only 30 people perished in the sinking of the Britannic, and over 1,000 survived. So many people survived because the accident happened in the morning, when the temperature of the water was warmer and the Greek island Kea was close by to offer help. In the end, the Britannic only sailed the seas for over 2.5 years. The bad luck that followed the Titanic and the Britannic and the accidents and demise of the Olympic was remarkable. But what was most impressive is that there was a woman who sailed on all 3 ships and survived. Violet Jessup was a crew member and nurse aboard the ships. She was there when the Olympic collided with the HMS Hawk in 1911 and disembarked safely. 2 years later, she escaped the sinking of the Titanic in lifeboat number 16, and she showed some women it was safe to board the lifeboats. You'd imagine that would be enough to keep her from ever getting on a boat again, but not for her. A few years later, she served as a nurse in the Britannic while it was used as a hospital ship. When the explosion occurred, Violet jumped overboard, was pulled under by the water, and hit her head on the keel but survived. Can you imagine her experience? She must have had nerves of steel. All in all, the trio of ships saw journeys of triumph and tragedy. Ill fate might have followed them, but all the survivors were left with incredible stories to tell. So tell us, Brightsiders, would you have liked to have seen any of these ships in real life? Let us know in the comments section. Don't forget to give this video a like, share it with your friends, and click subscribe to stay on the bright side.
Bet you never heard this story about the Titanic. So, this massive luxury ocean liner was heading out of Southampton on its first voyage to New York with over 2,000 passengers and crew on board. I'll spare you the details for now. You know how it all went down. Since there were a lot of things that went wrong during its short lifespan, some couldn't help but wonder, was it really bad luck? Or was there some mysterious force behind the ruckus? Well, for starters, right as it was leaving the harbor, the Titanic nearly crashed into another ship, called the SS New York. How did that happen? Well, 6 tugboats had to pull the massive Titanic into the river to begin its journey. Captain Smith was in charge, but let's be honest, he probably needed a few more cups of coffee before making any big decisions. So, as the Titanic was speeding along, minding her own business, she passed the New York and the Oceanic ships. The Titanic decided to make a left turn, but the suction was just too much for the poor New York. She started to drift off towards the Titanic. The Oceanic was leaning so much, her gangplank smacked into the water like a belly flop in the pool. Thankfully, the captain of one of the tugboats was there to save the day. He used his trusty megaphone to call the Vulcan to the port side of the Titanic to pick up some crew members. He then noticed the New York in trouble and acted quickly, throwing a line to slow her down. The Titanic's captain was probably scratching his head, wondering how to handle these big ships like the Titanic. That's because he'd only recently experienced sailing on larger ships. Close one, right? Well, it was just part of the story. As it turns out, the huge list of misfortunes might have started even earlier. Another theory suggests that during the ship's construction days in Northern Ireland, a fire broke out in the coal bunkers. Talk about a rocky start. If this information is correct, then the ship's hull may have been affected by the incident before it even set sail. Fans of this theory argue that a fire popped up inside one of the Titanic's large coal bunkers and really damaged an important segment of the ship's hull. Some claim there's even photographic evidence to back this up. A bunch of photos documenting how the ship was made and pampered for its maiden voyage were found, and they showed a significant black streak on the outside of the Titanic's hull. Weirdly enough, the streak was really close to where the iceberg hit during that cold April. Now I know what you're thinking. This theory might sound far-fetched, but most of these people have been gathering information about the Titanic for decades, and they're convinced that this is the real deal. They even believe that the fire started way earlier than the day the Titanic set out on its maiden voyage, particularly about 3 weeks prior. Why was this overlooked? Well, because of fear of bad press, mostly. Also, because of all the fuss created around the unsinkable ship, it was important that they stuck to the initial calendar. Of course, not everyone is convinced by this new theory. Some people think it's just another wacky idea to add to the long list of Titanic sensational theories. What if I told you there were even rumors about part of an ancient Egyptian coffin being on board? Could that have had something to do with the disastrous ending of the Titanic? Some truly believe it did. Let me tell you the story about the unlucky mummy. It's a tale that'll give you goosebumps. Back in the 19th century, this ancient Egyptian artifact, a mummy case lid to be exact, was brought over to Europe. And as soon as it arrived, strange things started happening. Now, some of the stories may be a bit exaggerated, but according to journalists, some of them were actually true. The rumors sparked the interest of a British writer who later spent months investigating the mummy case and its alleged related stories. He was planning to write an article debunking the myths, but he found out they were all too real. Unfortunately, he never got to finish his work because he passed away suddenly. Others believed that the mummy case was guarded by Egyptian elementals. They warned others not to mess with the artifact. The mummy case's history is just as spooky. It was found in Egypt and sold to a certain someone conveniently named Mr. W at a party organized by a well-known English lady. When the mummy case arrived in England, it was given to Mr. W's sister, who immediately suffered from financial losses and other troubles. A photographer who took a picture of the case claimed that he captured a living woman's face on the film. The mummy case eventually ended up in the British Museum, and it's still there today. However, rumors say that it was aboard the Titanic and was responsible for its sinking. But don't believe everything you hear. Some sources claim the mummy case never left the British Museum, and the rumor was started by a journalist named William Stead. He was actually a passenger on the Titanic, and he supposedly told his fellow passengers about the ill-fated mummy before the ship went down. Is that what happens when you tempt fate? Seriously doubt it, but it does make you wonder, doesn't it? It gets even weirder, trust me. About 50 passengers got cold feet before the ship took off, and they refused to board the Titanic at the last minute, even if it meant that they'd lose the cost of the ticket. They just had an extremely bad feeling about the whole deal, and even an Irish astrologer warned against making the voyage on the Titanic. I doubt he saw a big ol' iceberg hidden somewhere in the stars, but it does add up to the mystique surrounding the Titanic. And do you know what's even worse? The fact that the ship's binoculars, which could have helped prevent the iceberg collision, were locked up. Apparently, those binoculars could have been used by lookouts on that fateful night. But guess what? The key was held by David Blair, an officer who was sadly bumped from the crew before the ship's departure. Poor guy. He probably didn't even know what he was holding on to. Now, some historians think that if those binoculars were in use, the iceberg might have been spotted earlier. But hey, let's not point fingers here. Others argue that it wouldn't have made a difference. Who knows? Maybe the lookout was too busy looking at the stars to notice a giant iceberg in front of them. But seriously, what were they thinking? Locking up the binoculars on a ship that big is like forgetting to pack sunscreen for a trip to the beach. Also, the ship might have been going a bit too fast. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why was the captain in such a hurry? Well, apparently, good old Captain Smith was trying to beat his ship's older sibling, the Olympic, in a race to see which ship could cross the Atlantic faster. I guess he had a bit of a sibling rivalry going on or something. But here's the thing. Even though there were warnings about icebergs in the area, the Titanic just kept on chugging along at full speed ahead. I mean, come on, guys, it's not rocket science. If you know there are icebergs around, maybe slow down a little bit, right? And then, close to midnight on April 14th, 1912, the Titanic hit that iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. It also famously had a mere 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsible dinghies on board. No wonder it ended up being one of the worst maritime disasters in modern history. After the whole event, people started believing in life beyond the veil and contacted mediums, hoping for signs from the ones they had lost at sea. Can't say I blame them, though there's no verified story of someone managing to contact a Titanic passenger from the beyond, though.
We know Titanic from so many stories, even a movie, but now we have its first full-sized digital scan. And nope, it's not like those models from before, where we mostly imagined what the ship was supposed to be like. This time we got a real digital scan. A team of experts really mapped the deep sea floor around the Titanic together with the ship itself. We basically got a 3D view of the entire wreck, which is like going deep down beneath the ocean's surface and seeing Titanic as if all the water has been drained away. So, the story of the wreck started in 1985, 73 years after the Titanic went down. The explorer named Robert Ballard stumbled upon it somewhere between two submarines that also went down in that area. He was actually on a different task back then, so he didn't even have time to explore the ship properly. But as he was searching for the submarines, he realized how ocean currents affect sinking debris. He noticed the heaviest object sank quickly and left a trail of debris behind, the trail that followed the currents. Using this knowledge, Ballard made a hypothesis the Titanic had broken in two and left a debris trail as it sank. Before he found the wreck, everyone thought the ship just went down in one piece after hitting an iceberg. So everyone knew where the ship was so the adventure could start, or not. It was hard to explore it. The ship is enormous, and the dark depths of the ocean make it really difficult to capture its whole body in one go. So we mostly relied on glimpses of the decaying ship, and had to settle with teasing scattered parts of the whole picture and filling it up with speculations and stories. But in the summer of 2022, we finally got something different. A team of experts from Magellan Loaded, a company specializing in mapping the deep sea, teamed up with Atlantic Productions, who were making a documentary about the project. They embarked on a mission to capture the complete view of the Titanic. They used submersibles. Those are vehicles that go underwater, remotely controlled by a team of skilled explorers. These submersibles dove deep into the ocean. It wasn't an easy job. They spent over 200 hours collecting information about the entire length and breadth of the wreck. It was like a real-life treasure hunt. But instead of finding gold and jewels, they took something even more precious. Over 700,000 images of the Titanic from every angle possible. Yup, they took photos of every tiny part of the ship, even the not-so-interesting bits most of us would usually skip. Even mapping the muddy parts was an important part, because it helped fill in the gaps between the more exciting things they discovered. And this was a way for all of us to finally get a detailed 3D reconstruction. Even though it's been more than 100 years, you can still recognize the bow of the Titanic, covered in rust that hangs down like stalactites. On top of the bow is the boat deck, where a big hole gives us a glimpse into the empty space where the grand staircase once stood, like a window into the ship's glamorous past. Its stern is now a wild mess of twisted metal. As the Titanic went down, this part collapsed and spiraled into the seabed. The bow and the stern ended up separated by about 2,600 feet. There's a vast field of debris surrounding this giant, stuck on the seafloor. This debris is like a scattered treasure trove, full of intricate metalwork from the ship, statues, and even unopened champagne bottles. There are also personal belongings that went down together with the ship, like dozens of shoes resting across the seafloor. It was a tough task to do, go down and take all those pictures. It may not sound that hard at first, considering it was the vehicle that really immersed itself into such deep parts of the ocean, not the people. But studying the ocean is hard. We haven't explored, mapped, or even seen over 80% of it. The conditions are harsh, and the pressure becomes more intense the deeper you go. And their vehicle had to dive down to nearly 13,120 feet below the surface. That's like 12 Eiffel Towers stacked on top of each other. Plus, you have strong currents in that area, so it was probably like trying to navigate through a watery maze. And submersibles weren't supposed to touch anything. Even the slightest wrong step can damage the wreck that was already so fragile. It seems like the Titanic is frozen in time, so it will always be there waiting for us. But in reality, it's slowly disappearing. It's pretty obvious that the ocean water ruined it considering how long it has been down there. But it's not just that. The wreck itself has become a home for a specific type of Bacteria Halomonas titanicae that even got named after the famous ship. These bacteria have a special ability. They can survive inside rusty formations known as rusticles. They kind of look like icicles, those spikes of ice that form when water falls from something and freezes. These bacteria have a taste for iron, which is abundant in the ship's hull. For them, it's like a real buffet down there. And as time goes by, these bacteria will keep eating away at the iron in the ship, bit by bit, until one day, the feast comes to an end and the whole ship is gone. It's like a slow but steady recycling process. So this 3D model we got because of the hardworking team and technology comes at the best time because we never know how much time we have left with exploring the famous wreck. This time we might even understand the collision with the iceberg better. You know how movies always show the Titanic hitting the iceberg on its right side? Well, we can't even be certain about that. The scans could help us figure out if the ship actually grounded on the iceberg, like getting stuck on it. We can study the stern and analyze how the Titanic struck the seafloor. That will also help us understand what really happened during the sinking. Maybe we'll get a chance to discover if there was really a strong fire that sealed the fate of the Titanic. One theory says that the coal fire had been raging for a whole 3 weeks before the ship even took its first and last trip. And this could have made its hull weaker, which means most of the work was done. The iceberg just delivered the final blow, if there even was an iceberg, as some people wonder. There's an alternative theory they suggested where the Titanic may have actually hit a hidden mass of pack ice instead of a typical iceberg. Pack ice is made up of large sheets of ice that float near the ocean's surface and can be difficult to spot. They believe this pack ice might have drifted into the Atlantic from the Arctic Ocean. According to one professional mariner, Captain L.M. Collins, that stands up with that idea. If the Titanic had struck a regular iceberg, the ship would have sunk much more quickly than it did. And since the Titanic managed to stay on the surface for a relatively long period of time, less than 3 hours, maybe this was a different type of collision. The mariner also said there are differences in what people said they saw when the Titanic sank. He thinks these differences might be because of optical illusions. In this case, when people were looking at the ocean that night, the way the light was reflecting and the conditions at sea might have made things appear closer or distorted. So when they saw something in the water, it might not have been exactly what they thought it was. Whether it was an iceberg or something else. Binoculars might have helped the crew members to spot the potential danger, but unfortunately, they didn't have any. It appears they were locked inside a cabinet, and no one knew where the key was.
If I asked you to name the most famous shipwreck of all time, you'd go with the Titanic, right? The Atlantic Ocean, the hope for new life, heartbreaking love stories. It had it all to become a blockbuster. But I guess you've never heard of SS Princess Alice that submerged in the sewage of the River Thames, taking between 600 and 700 lives with it. Life in 19th century Victorian London wasn't easy, especially for working class folks. Affordable public transport and bank holidays made it a bit easier. The people could escape to the coast on a train or pleasure boat, even if it was just for a day. Sheerness on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent started as a fort under Henry VIII and then grew into a bustling town with a dockyard. When they added a railway station in 1863, it became a prime destination for day trippers and holidaymakers. Seaside promenades, charming piers, and a whole bunch of fun stuff to do by the sea. It had it all. A bit inland along the River Thames, you had the Rocherville Gardens. These gardens had archery lawns, bowls, mazes, lakes, cliff walks, and even a floral bazaar. Plus, there was an aviary, a bear pit, and a skeleton of a lost whale that had taken a wrong turn in the Thames. Londoners of the late 19th century could hop on a train or cruise along the Thames by boat, and both options were pretty popular. But on the 3rd of September, 1878, way more people than usual opted for the boat. They chose it over the railroad after a passenger train had collided with goods wagons in Kent, taking the lives of 5 people. The river felt like a safer way to go. One of the ships available for the trip was the SS Princess Alice. The paddle steamer was first launched in 1865 on the west coast of Scotland. Its original name was the Bute, and it was used as a ferry for the passengers of the Wemyss Bay Railway Company. A couple of years later, it was sold and renamed after Queen Victoria's 3rd child. Then, it was sold again and got the nickname the Shah's Boat, as it transported the Shah of Persia up the Thames to Greenwich in 1873. The ship had gone through several alterations in its lifetime. It got new boilers and watertight bulkheads. The Board of Trade had inspected it and marked it safe. In the year of its final voyage, it was officially allowed to carry up to 936 passengers between London and Gravesend in calm water. On the day of the tragedy, Princess Alice was on what was called a moonlight trip downstream from Swan Pier near London Bridge to Sheerness, Kent and back. The trip wasn't expensive, so most of the passengers were from the working class. There was also a musical band aboard to keep the spirits up. The 3rd of September was a bright day, and many families were happy they could catch some final summer sun rays and enjoy fresh sea air. The then owner of the ship, the London Steamboat Company, had several vessels working on the route. The passengers were free to hop on and off different ships. At around 6:30 p.m., after a beautiful day in the open, the SS Princess Alice headed back to Swan Pier. No one kept official lists of passengers, so we'll never know exactly how many people were on board that evening. But they say the steamer was close to its full capacity. As it got darker and cooler, many families decided to stay inside the saloon or in their cabins below. Some stories from the steamer sound like fate. The captain of Princess Alice let his steerer stay at Gravesend and replaced him with one of the passengers. John Ayres was a sailor but had little experience at the Thames or with a vessel like Princess Alice. Alfred Thomas Merriman, a chef from East London, had been offered to work on the steamer at the last moment. He was 30 years old and a father of 4, so he couldn't say no to extra money. At around 7:40 p.m., he was standing on the deck by the saloon door. By that time, Princess Alice had passed Tripcock Point and entered Galleon's Reach. The passengers could see the North Woolwich Pier in the distance. Many of them planned to disembark at that stop. And that's when Merriman noticed a huge ship carrying coal. It was Bywell Castle. This vessel normally carried coal to Africa, but it had just been repainted at a dry dock. Bywell Castle was going to Newcastle to pick up some coal and transport it to Alexandria, Egypt. The ship's captain, Harrison, wasn't too familiar with these waters, so he called in Christopher Dix, a seasoned Thames River pilot, to lend a hand, even though he didn't have to. The ship had a fancy raised forward part below the deck, and Dix couldn't quite see what was in front of him. So, they had a sailor on lookout duty. As they set sail from Millwall at the speed of 5 knots, 5.7 miles per hour, they tried to stick to the middle of the river, but other boats had other plans. When they were approaching Galleon's Reach, Dick spotted Princess Alice's red port light, headed their way, but planning to pass on the right side. At the same time, Grinstead, the captain of Princess Alice, was going against the river's flow, trying to find the smooth waters on the south side. He adjusted his course, steering into Bywell Castle's path. Both crews realized they were headed for a collision. Dix tried to steer clear and even ordered reverse full speed on the engines, but it was too late. The Bywell Castle collided head-on with the Princess Alice, which was much smaller, weighing less than a third of the 890-ton coal-carrying collier. It sliced the passenger steamer in two. As Merriman remembered later, laughter on board immediately changed into screaming and panic. Some people rushed to the bridge for safety. Merriman hurried to the captain, asking what to do next. The captain's response was grim. "We are sinking fast. Do your best." The ends of the steamer went high into the air, and the middle just sank, taking passengers with it. Those unfortunate ones who were below deck were tragically trapped. The impact caused tons of untreated sewage to gush from outlets near the collision site. The water became a frothy mess of unprocessed waste with a horrible odor. It was potent enough to make even the most resilient sailors retch. Amid the chaos, passengers struggled for life in the contaminated water. They inhaled lungfuls of hazardous waste without knowing. The crew aboard the Bywell Castle sprang into action. They dropped ropes from their deck, urging Princess Alice's passengers to climb aboard. Anything that could float, from planks to barrels, was tossed into the water to serve as flotation devices for those in need. Other members of their team launched a lifeboat, saving 14 people. Nearby boats, moored along the riverbanks, joined the mission, plucking survivors from the water. Many of Princess Alice's passengers didn't know how to swim, and it was even trickier for ladies wearing long, heavy dresses. Merriman was among the lucky ones who could swim. He first held on to a piece of wreckage, and then, when others got to it, swam away and caught onto a rope hanging over the side of the Bywell Castle. They managed to save around 130 people this way. Another survivor was Robert Haynes, who played in the Princess Alice band. He was fond of ships and had noticed the Bywell Castle a couple of minutes before the collision. He chose not to follow the rest of the band, who went downstairs for a break, and that saved his life. Princess Alice's sister ship, Duke of Teck, arrived 10 minutes too late to assist with the rescue efforts. Only 2 people who had been below deck or in the saloon managed to survive the collision. We still don't know the total count of lives taken on that day, but it's somewhere between 650 and 700. And what makes this story even more tragic is that it has been mostly forgotten.
It was 11:39 at night when the Titanic's lookout shouted, "Iceberg, right ahead!" Swift action on the bridge to reduce speed and change the ship's course didn't help, and you already know how the story ends. Since then, we've regarded what happened to Titanic as a once-in-a-lifetime event. Is it though? The Titanic sank in 1912. Forget about fancy GPSs or weather satellites. At the time, ships were responsible for warning each other about the location of icebergs, like a "hey man, trust me on this" situation. Then the Titanic disaster happened. To call it a disaster is an understatement, so specialists felt the need to form an organization to avoid this kind of accident happening again. That's why, a year later, they created the International Ice Patrol, or IIP for short. Up to this day, this group has been responsible for giving ships advanced warnings about ice threats. IIP improved their methods over the years, from ship reports and aircraft patrols to satellite images. Recently, they've also been using oceanographic buoys, floating devices providing real-time information about ocean conditions up to 164 feet below the surface to predict the potential drift of icebergs. Luckily, IIP is doing an excellent job in reducing ship iceberg collisions. But don't get too comfortable, because even the most advanced detection equipment can't entirely avoid an unfortunate situation. Between 1980 and 2005, there were 57 incidents involving vessels and icebergs. And the chilling truth is that today's ships are more likely to run into an iceberg than the Titanic was. Studies have shown that 1,038 icebergs crossed the area where the Titanic sank back in 1912. You might think that's a lot, but scientists say it's not really a big deal. I mean, yeah, it's on the higher side, but there have been 14 years with even more iceberg activity since then. Nowadays, the number of icebergs is going up due to the accelerated melting of Greenland's glaciers. And since more ships are heading into polar waters, the chances of ships bumping into icebergs are higher. But the real danger for captains is invisible enemies, called growlers and bergy bits. Growlers are these small icebergs that can be the size of a regular door. And bergy bits are also considered small, measuring around the size of a school bus. These icebergs might seem harmless, but they're actually tricky since they can be completely invisible to radars or satellites. Let's see what happens when a modern cruise ship as big as the Titanic hits one of these small icebergs. Meet the Norwegian Sun, a luxurious cruise ship like Titanic, as it has the capacity to accommodate 2,400 passengers and more than 900 crew members. On July 2022, this cruise ship was on its way to Hubbard Glacier in Alaska when it found itself in the middle of a dense fog. Suddenly, passengers felt an impact and were terrified as the ship experienced a severe jolt. The fog immediately cleared and they realized what had happened. The Norwegian Sun had collided with an iceberg of the growler type. But the outcome was entirely different from Titanic. Thankfully, there were no injuries, and both the passengers and staff reached the Alaskan docks safely. Expert divers checked the condition of the boat, and they discovered that the ship had suffered some damage after the collision, so the rest of the trip was canceled. Now don't stress about packing for your next trip across the Atlantic, because accidents like the one with the Norwegian Sun are really rare. I mean, it's common for ships to encounter ice, but what's unusual is for it to be a problem. Most modern cruise ships wouldn't get physically damaged by an iceberg, and there's a reason for that. You see, the steel used in the Titanic also played a significant role in the disaster. The unsinkable ship, after all, was not so impact-resistant. Back then, the Titanic's hull was constructed using around 2,000 steel plates, which are believed to have been produced in an open hearth furnace. As a result, the steel contained a high concentration of phosphorus, oxygen, and sulfur. High levels of these elements make steel brittle at low temperatures, causing it to fail upon impact. While the steel used on the Titanic was of the highest quality available at the time, it wouldn't meet the safety standards of modern ships, and it was approximately 10 times less safe than what today's vessels use. But the most significant difference between the design of the Titanic and a modern ship lies in how the hull is put together. You see, the Titanic was built using over 3 million rivets for its hull and upper deck structure. So, when it struck the iceberg, the rivets started a chain reaction, causing the entire section of the hull to collapse simultaneously, causing an uncontrollable flood of water. In contrast, modern ships use a method called submerged arc welding, which fuses the edges of metal pieces together, creating a strong and continuous bond. This is safer because if any part of the ship gets damaged, the tear doesn't spread, making things worse. The damage remains contained within that section. Okay, so small icebergs are becoming more common, and vessels have been adapted to deal with them. But there's still one more scenario to consider. What if a huge cruise ship hit an iceberg the size of a 5-story building? Imagine we've just created the world's largest cruise ship on the planet. Let's call it the Bright Seaside. Our floating resort is massive, 4 times the size of the Statue of Liberty. It's longer than the Titanic by 318 feet and carries about 3 times more passengers and crew. And just like the Titanic, our fictional ship can cruise at a top speed of around 23 knots. Now, picture this scenario. The Bright Seaside is cruising at full speed in freezing waters. It's the middle of the night, and the captain doesn't realize that all the iceberg detecting equipment on board isn't functioning. It stopped working 3 days ago. It's very foggy out there, and the lookout also fails to spot a 45-foot tall iceberg. If that whole situation played out, and the ship smacked into the iceberg head-on, well, it could potentially lead to a sinking. But you can see how unlikely that is, right? That's why experts are quite confident in saying that ice isn't likely to sink modern cruise ships. It's also worth mentioning that safety measures have improved a lot since Titanic. A modern large vessel can take days to sink, which provides enough time to keep everyone safe. Crews are definitely better prepared to handle evacuation procedures, and passengers should also go through safety training before cruising. I know, it is annoying to do that when all you want to do is drink a lemonade or some other beverage by the pool. But, all these safety tips are what saved the MS Explorer from becoming a modern Titanic. You see, back in 2007, all 154 people on board this Antarctic cruise ship managed to get into lifeboats after the ship hit an iceberg. Now, imagine their panic as they waited for help for 4 hours. The crew did an excellent job in keeping everybody safe, no doubt. But a report that came out 2 years later said that the MS Explorer accident had happened because of the inexperience of the captain, who had pushed the ship too fast into a wall of ice in the freezing waters of Antarctica. That means that no matter how much tech a ship's got or how fancy its materials are, if you've got a careless captain and a crew that doesn't know how to handle an iceberg hit, yep, a disaster similar to Titanic could happen again. But hey, you shouldn't stress over it. Trust the professionals and keep in mind the odds. In the last 30 years, the MS Explorer was the only cruise ship that sank thanks to an iceberg, And everyone survived. So kick back and enjoy your sea vacation.
The cause of the Titanic crash was an iceberg, or so we've always been told. But new research has come to light that debunks this theory. On April 15, 1915, Titanic, the biggest ship of its time, completely disappeared under the ice-cold surface of the Atlantic Ocean. It's hard to believe that such a massive and expensive creation could be destroyed by one simple iceberg, right? Well, recent findings suggest that the real cause of the disaster was a fire, not an iceberg. For over 3 decades, journalist Sinan Maloney has dedicated himself to studying the sinking of the Titanic. During his research, he made a significant discovery that shed new light on the well-known story. Maloney discovered a massive black spot on the hull of the Titanic, which measured an impressive 30 feet in length. He found it thanks to an unpublished album of photographs that showcased the construction and preparation of the ill-fated ship's first and final journey. Can you believe that most probably the fire on the Titanic had been burning at extreme temperatures for 3 whole weeks before anyone noticed it? Crazy, right? Apparently the high temperature corrupted the metal, making it 75% weaker. That's why the iceberg was able to make a hole in the ship. If not for the fire, the Titanic might have survived the crash because the iceberg apparently hit the exact spot we are talking about. And this is only one link in the chain of incredible coincidences that brought the Titanic down. The people in charge of the Titanic knew about the fire and knew the ship shouldn't have set sail. But they didn't want to go bankrupt and cancel the trip, especially since there was a coal shortage due to miners being on strike. The trip was already sold out, and there were no alternatives. Other ships canceled their trips due to low demand. Everyone wanted to board the Titanic, so the management bought up all the coal they could find, even from other ships, and set off. It was all about making money. To hide the truth, they turned the ship's hull so that the marks weren't visible from the dock and faced the sea. This way, the passengers wouldn't see them. Here's another sad twist in the Titanic story. Back then, there weren't any sonar systems to detect danger, so specially trained people had to watch out for threats using binoculars. But the binoculars on the Titanic were locked away in a special compartment, and the only person with the key, Second Officer David Blair, was replaced last minute before the ship took off. He forgot to hand the key over to his replacement. This mistake wasn't discovered until 3 days later when the ship was already at sea. If they had the binoculars, they might have seen the iceberg in time and avoided the crash. But even if they had the binoculars, they might not have been able to avoid the crash because the Titanic was going faster than it was supposed to. They were behind schedule and didn't want to ruin the ship's reputation, so they were going way beyond the speed limits the ship's construction could sustain. One of the biggest mistakes made on the Titanic was the decision to not include enough lifeboats. Even though the ship needed around 60 of them to contain all the passengers, it was only equipped with 20. The designer, Alexander Carlisle, had initially planned for 48 lifeboats, but this number was reduced for aesthetic purposes. Apparently, having too many lifeboats would have made the deck look too cluttered. These 20 boats were only able to hold a third of the passengers on board, which was not nearly enough to save everyone in the event of an emergency. What's even more shocking is that this number of lifeboats was technically legal at the time. Regulations for lifeboats were based on the tonnage of the ship, not the number of passengers. This means that even though the Titanic was carrying thousands of people, it still met the legal requirements for lifeboat capacity. Another serious mistake made by the crew was the decision to cancel the lifeboat drill scheduled for the day of the disaster. Lifeboat drills were standard practice on ocean liners at the time, but for no apparent reason, Captain Edward John Smith chose to cancel it. This meant that passengers were not prepared for an emergency, and the crew was not adequately trained to handle the situation. When the ship hit the iceberg, chaos ensued, and it took over half an hour to launch the lifeboats instead of the usual 10 minutes. Some folks put the blame on Captain Smith for the fact that the first set of lifeboats left partially empty. The very first lifeboat, which had seats for 65 people, only carried 27 passengers. There is an objective reason for this. At the beginning, people were reluctant to abandon the ship and didn't understand the gravity of their situation. In 2012, researchers uncovered that Captain Smith failed his initial navigation exam. Although he eventually passed, some people wonder if this could have played a role in the disaster. During the Titanic's final moments, the crew attempted to send out distress signals to nearby ships, including the Californian. However, the Californian failed to respond to the flares shot into the sky, and the captain ultimately lost his job as a result of this negligence. However, recent research has exonerated the captain and proved his innocence. It turns out that light refraction, caused by layers of cold air below warmer air, created mirages that distorted the signals from the Titanic. This phenomenon had been observed by other ships sailing in the area and is now believed to be the reason why the lookouts on the Titanic missed the iceberg completely. Historian Tim Malton supports this theory and has further contributed to our understanding of this event. It's unfortunate that the captain of the Californian lost his job due to circumstances beyond his control, but it's better late than never that his reputation is cleared. Whatever the reason for Titanic's crash was, it still keeps the minds of scientists busy to this day. But let's see what the buzz was all about. What made the Titanic so famous and unique? The Titanic was massive, standing at 175 feet tall and nearly 900 feet long. The ship was so enormous that even the officers took over 2 weeks to memorize all the decks and passageways. You could be walking miles along its corridors. The construction cost of the ship was a whopping $7,500,000, which would be equivalent to about $166 million in the mid-2010 ES, due to inflation. Interestingly, the production cost of the Titanic movie in 1997 was even higher at $200 million. Building the Titanic was no small feat, and it required a labor force of 3,000 men who worked 6 days a week for 26 months. The job was difficult and dangerous, and workers had to complete tasks at the height of a 20-story building without safety ropes. Nevertheless, they were paid a competitive wage of £2 a week, which was considered good pay at the time. The inside of the Titanic was inspired by the luxurious Ritz Hotel in London. The most impressive feature of the ship's interior was the grand staircase, which extended through 7 of the ship's 10 decks. The staircase was adorned with ornate paintings, bronze cherubs, and oak paneling. The first-class passengers had access to an impressive array of facilities, including a heated swimming pool, Turkish bath, gym, squash court, beauty salon, and even a stylist to help them prepare for dinner. First-class passengers on the Titanic were pampered to an extraordinary extent. They had their own onboard newspaper, the Atlantic Daily Bulletin, and even their dogs were taken care of with a special area where they could be fed, walked, and trained during the voyage. The first-class meals were a grand affair, with 13 courses and a different wine for each course. These dinners could last up to 5 hours, and they were certainly something to look forward to. With such opulence and luxury on board, it's not surprising that so many people were eager to take the first trip on the Titanic. "I'll never let go, Jack. I'll never let go," said Rose. Then she did let go, and the whole movie theater burst into tears. It happened when Titanic came out in 1997. Alright, who am I kidding? It's really hard not to cry when you watch this scene for the 10th, 20th, and 50th time almost 30 years later. But did this great love story happen in real life? Or did James Cameron just invent it for some good drama? As much as I don't want to disappoint you, Jack and Rose never fell in love on board the real Titanic. There was a real Jay Dawson on the luxurious ocean liner, but he was a crew member, and his full name was Joseph. The real-life inspiration for Rose was the American artist Beatrice Wood. James Cameron came across her biography while he was working on the first draft of the script and decided to bring her love for art and family background into the story. It doesn't mean that the movie is completely off when it comes to historical accuracy, though. The unsinkable ship that sank departed from Southampton, England to New York and was 400 miles south of Newfoundland on April 14th when crew members noticed the iceberg. The contact with it lasted 37 seconds, precisely as long as the corresponding scene in the movie. Remember this guy, Thomas Andrews, who was wandering around with a small notebook and pencil? He was the real ship designer. Andrews was quite talented at what he did and had worked on many successful projects before the Titanic. He would normally travel on the ships he designed during the maiden voyage to make sure everything was going smoothly. He boarded the Titanic as one of the first-class passengers and was taking notes all the time. After the unfortunate rendezvous with an iceberg, Andrews was seen inspecting the flooded parts of the ship with Captain Smith. According to his sad forecast, the Titanic would have gone down in about 2 hours. One of the stewards claimed that he had seen Thomas Andrews moments before the sinking. He chose not to leave the Titanic and didn't put on his life belt. No one had seen him ever since. Another memorable moment from the movie is a boy playing on one of the decks with his spinning top. This was an accurate recreation of a real photo that was taken on board the Titanic on April 11, 1912. The passengers in the photo are first-class passengers Frederick Spedden and his 6-year-old son Douglas. The family was going back home to America after traveling around Algeria. When the evacuation of passengers began, Spedden's nurse told him they were going to see the stars. They say he had successfully slept through the entire drama and woke up safe and sound in a lifeboat the following morning. His father had also survived the sinking. Sadly, an automobile accident took the life of Douglas just 3 years later. One of Titanic's most charismatic ladies, both on the screen and in real life, got her nickname Unsinkable Molly Brown for a good reason. Several witnesses remembered she was, indeed, trying to persuade others in her lifeboat to go back and save more lives, just like in that heartbreaking scene from the movie. When Carpathia came to the rescue of the surviving Titanic passengers, Margaret Brown was helping lower-class survivors and involved her fellow first-class passengers in the process. Once they all got on solid ground, Brown organized a survivors committee. She awarded the captain of the Carpathia for rescuing so many people and was really upset she hadn't been allowed to testify at the Titanic hearings because she was a woman. You won't see any fumes above the fourth pipe of the ship in the movie. It's not a technical mistake. The Titanic, indeed, had it only for more impressive looks and didn't really need that pipe. Back in 1911, the year before our hero's departure, large ships would mostly sail with 4 chimneys. They needed those to draw heat and fumes from their massive boilers. The Titanic was a real engineering gem that only needed 3 chimneys to function. So the 4th was added for balance. They thought the public would have been disappointed to only see 3 pipes on the greatest ship of all time. The movie had an impressive budget, $200 million, but even that wasn't enough to cover all the possible costs. Cameron knew they had to save some money, so they built the replica of the liner only on the starboard, which means the right side. They chose this side to make things look more realistic. The wind at the filming location was moving mostly from north to south, so with the fumes going out, it looked like the liner was actually moving through the ocean. But if you remember one of the first scenes with the Titanic departing from Southampton and people waving, you'll understand why the crew had a problem with it. The real ship was docked at the port, or left side, there. They found a brilliant solution and just flipped the scene horizontally to make it look real. The letters and buttons on costumes were reversed, and actors walked in the opposite direction for everything to be changed in post-production. One of the scenes I can't watch without tears is the elderly couple holding on to each other as they go down with the Titanic. The couple who inspired this heartbreaking episode were real people, some of the richest passengers of the not-so-unsinkable ship. They were Isidore and Ida Strauss, and they owned Macy's. When news of the disaster spread, they put on life jackets and ran to the decks along with others. Ida stepped onto the lifeboat, but Isidore refused to do so before all the ladies and little ones were there. Ida didn't want to leave her husband. She climbed out of the lifeboat and handed her mink coat to her maid, saying she would no longer need it. Isidore wrapped his arms around Ida, and they remained on the bridge of the ship until a huge wave swept them both into the sea. So the bed scene wasn't that accurate, and James Cameron later admitted he had taken some license as a director. You know this guy who was drinking from a flask next to the main characters as the ship was going down? His name was Charles Jugan from England, and he was in charge of 10 bakers, 2 confectioners, and a Vienna baker aboard. He was expecting to earn a real lump sum and would have been one of the best-paid crew members if everything had gone well. The night the iceberg hit, Joe Hin was off duty, taking a rest in his bunk. He immediately woke up and sent his bakers to deliver bread to lifeboats. He then returned to his room for a drink. Once he came back on the deck, he helped others get in his assigned lifeboat. There was no more room for Charles inside, so he ended up on the outside of the rails of the ship. Finally, when the Titanic submerged, he just swam away, and as the sun rose again, he found one of the lifeboats and was rescued by Carpathia. The contents of the flask must have helped him survive. The well-dressed man who decided to stay on the Titanic forever was American businessman Benjamin Guggenheim. That last name probably sounds familiar. And yes, he was from that famous family. Guggenheim was traveling with his valet, his significant other, a singer from France called Leontine, her maid, and their chauffeur. They all boarded the Titanic in France during one of the short stops it made after leaving Southampton. When disaster struck, Benjamin was helping the ladies get in their lifeboat. He reportedly said they were only saying goodbye till the next day. He was sure the ship would be quickly repaired. After helping many women and youngsters get in the boats, Guggenheim chose not to fight over the remaining seats. He and his valet returned from the decks to their first-class suite and put on their finest suits to go down like gentlemen.
We've heard so much information about this terrible tragedy that happened on the night of April 14, 1912. What really caused the disaster? Could the Titanic passengers have been saved? Was the ship cursed? All these questions still remain unanswered. So this time, let's not focus on the tragic side of the event, but on the fantastic stories of people who miraculously managed to survive that day and what happened to them in the future. As you know, when Titanic crashed into the iceberg, the ship's crew first evacuated the women and children. But among the passengers, one woman remained on the sunken vessel and survived after it went underwater. Her name was Rhoda Abbott. She and her 2 sons lived in England and had been living there for 2 years before they decided to return home to Providence, Rhode Island. Rhoda bought 3 third-class tickets for the most modern and unsinkable ship of that time. The whole family slept in their cabin on that ominous night from April 14th to 15th. They didn't feel the jolt and got up only after the steward knocked on the door. He asked them to wear life jackets and go to the upper deck. Then, along with other third-class passengers, they waited in line to board the lifeboats. The crew members allowed only women and little kids to go further. Still, the brothers negotiated with the team and walked their mother to the lifeboat. All 3 went to the last lifeboat, but the crew asked the sons to leave since not all the women had been evacuated. Rhoda didn't want to leave her sons, so she decided to stay with them. She left the boat and hugged the boys. By this time, the ship was sinking into a stern-up position. The deck tilted. Rhoda tried to hold her sons but couldn't. She slapped off the deck and fell into the icy water. From there, she swam to the lifeboat that was washed away from the deck. Rhoda climbed aboard and watched the Titanic go under the water. Unfortunately, she was unable to save her 2 sons. Besides her, there were 13 people in the boat. But in the end, no one except Rhoda survived. A few hours later, the ship Carpathia arrived and found a nearly frozen Rhoda in the boat. The vessel arrived almost 3 days later in New York, where Rhoda was hospitalized, and she lay there for about 2 weeks. Swimming in cold water caused her asthma, which remained with her for life. Later, she admitted that she hadn't regretted that she had refused to evacuate with other women because she got a little extra time to spend with her sons that night. Another survivor of Titanic was Violet Jessup. She boarded the ship not as a passenger, but as a working staff. She was hired by the White Star Line, which was looking for people to serve wealthy clients on the new luxury liner. And on April 10th, after an interview, Violet boarded the Titanic. The first days of work went as usual, but then the ship crashed into an iceberg. In the beginning, no one panicked and didn't even want to believe that the unsinkable boat could go down. But while the people on the upper deck were having these conversations, water flooded the ship's hold. Violet, along with other stewards, helped people evacuate. One of the ship's commanders ordered Violet to get into the boat first to show everyone else it was safe. She obeyed and spent several hours there until rescuers came for the survivors. But the most exciting thing in this story was that before the Titanic, Violet had already been in another shipwreck. The ship where she worked as a steward collided with another vessel at sea. All the people were saved, and Violet got a job on the Titanic a few years later. But even after the famous shipwreck, she didn't change her profession and went to the Britannic Floating Hospital. And you know what? It also sank. Violet managed to survive for the 3rd time, but this didn't scare the girl. After all these events, she continued her work on other ships. She survived 3 shipwrecks and got a name for this: Miss Unsinkable. One of the bravest passengers of the Titanic was the ship's chief baker, Charles Jogan. On the night of April 14th, he woke up after the collision with the iceberg. During the few hours as the ship was sinking underwater, Charles helped the passengers. First, he ordered his bakers to supply all rescue boats with food, then helped the crew evacuate the passengers. He was one of the last people left on the ship when all rescue boats were on the water. But still, he continued to save people's lives. Charles started to throw deck chairs overboard so people could hold on to them. Then, when half of the Titanic went down, he lowered into the icy water, where he noticed a capsized rescue boat. Charles boarded it and waited a few hours until rescuers appeared. And the most incredible thing is that he was completely fine when the Carpathia arrived and found him. He had not even a scratch and wasn't at all hypothermic. Among the Titanic's surviving passengers was Margaret Brown, known as the Unsinkable Molly Brown. She was visiting a friend in England with her daughter. But when Margaret found out her grandson was ill, she immediately bought a ticket to New York on board the Titanic. After colliding with the iceberg, Margaret bravely helped people evacuate until the stewards forced her to get into a boat. She continued to help other passengers until they were rescued by the Carpathia. Margaret created a survivors committee and raised about $10,000. At that time, it was quite a lot of money. For many years, she protected and supported the Titanic's passengers, who were in poor financial condition. Margaret also helped to build the Titanic Memorial in Washington. A wealthy English businessman, J. Bruce Ismay, was on board the Titanic, and the shipwreck was not the only disaster for him. He managed to jump into the last boat 20 minutes before Titanic was completely submerged. Thus, he saved his life but condemned himself to eternal contempt. When he was on the mainland, the newspapers began to write about him as the main coward of the Titanic. Also, some articles accused him of sinking the ship. Ismay was a White Star Line company director that created the ship. And according to newspaper articles, the businessman asked the captain to sail faster. He wanted the ship to arrive in America ahead of schedule and receive good reviews in the press. As a result, the ship crashed into the iceberg at high speed and damaged the hull. Nobody proved the businessman's guilt. Almost all of the criticism of Bruce Ismay was concentrated in one newspaper. Its publisher had a fight with the businessman before the tragedy, so they decided to destroy his reputation. Britain organized an independent investigation, which concluded that Ismay did nothing wrong. Yeah, he jumped into the last boat, but only after all the women and children were evacuated. However, the investigation didn't help to clear his reputation. In England and America, many friends and colleagues turned away from him. For many years, Ismay compensated the families who lost someone on the Titanic. The most famous passengers of the Titanic were an orchestra of 8 musicians. In the beginning, there was no panic when the ship collided with the iceberg. Many refused to get into the boats, as it seemed to them that it was safer on the Titanic. Others were sure the breakdown on the ship would soon be repaired. Some people didn't believe the ship could sink. A minor panic began when everyone realized a catastrophe was imminent. To calm the people down a bit, the 8 musicians from 2 ensembles started playing music. Survivors said the orchestra played until the very end. Fear for their lives and the nearness of the end didn't confuse the valiant men. Unfortunately, they didn't survive, but a memory about them was written in history forever, and their musical instruments became world-famous artifacts and very valuable items at auctions. The Royal Mail Ship, or RMS Titanic, easily the most famous steamship in history, was once the symbol of luxury and dreams that promised to come true. It took 3 years and 3,000 people to construct it. On April 10, 1912, the brand new ocean liner greeted its passengers with the smell of fresh varnish, paint, and newly sawn wood. Back then, they still used lead for the production of paint and linseed oil as a binder, so that smell must have been powerful. When it was fully operational, the giant vessel consumed around 850 tons of coal per day, and the passengers would also smell its fumes. Another odor that must have filled the Titanic's decks, at least the first-class ones, was the new scent by the famous French perfume house Guerlain. It was released earlier in the same year and quickly became a hit with the well-off ladies. The perfume that you can still buy today is a mix of violets and iris with creamy vanilla. On the dramatic evening of April 14th, when Titanic only had hours to live, the unknowing waiters were serving oysters, lamb and mint sauce, roast duck with applesauce, and other delicacies to their first-class guests. The second class was filled with the smells of curried chicken, spring lamb, and roast turkey. Third-class passengers had simple gruel and biscuits that night. At 11 p.m., as the ship got dangerously close to the iceberg, the new smell added to the mix. It was a mineral odor with metallic notes. If you have ice in your fridge, you must have noticed it takes the smell of neighboring foods. The same happens to icebergs. They take on the odors of sea animals and maintain the chemical composition of the water that they're made of. If more people had known about the meaning of this particular metallic smell, they probably still wouldn't have saved the ship. But the number of people that managed to escape to safety could have been larger. Speaking of smells, in case you've ever wondered what space smells like but aren't planning to become an astronaut anytime soon, listen up. You can try out Ode to Space, an aroma that was designed by NASA decades ago. The idea of the perfume was to help astronauts prepare for their encounters with space at all levels during their training. But hold on a second, space is a vacuum, so it technically shouldn't have any smell. Yet, astronauts who have been out there remembered it as a pleasant metallic odor, something like the smell of welding fumes or burnt gunpowder. They could smell it on their spacesuits after coming back into their spacecraft. We can also guess what other planets smell like based on what their atmospheres are made of. Venus has clouds of sulfuric acid in its atmosphere, so it must smell like rotten eggs. Mars and Uranus also smell like rotten eggs, by the way. Each of the layers of Jupiter's atmosphere is made up of different chemicals. That's why it smells different depending on where you are. Some layers would greet you with a yummy aroma of bitter almonds or marzipan, and others, closer to the top, smell like cleaning products. The remaining planets of the solar system are unlikely to have a distinctive scent because they're mostly odorless gases in their atmospheres. As for our natural satellite, the Moon, the Apollo astronauts claim that its dust smells like gunpowder. The fragrance of fresh-cut grass makes regular mowing it nearly worth it. But did you know that the grass isn't having a great time while you're doing it? In fact, it's sort of screaming for help. And because grass can't scream out loud, it expresses discomfort by releasing a mix of smelly, volatile molecules. It does it to protect itself from insects. Caterpillars and other similar creatures just love to munch on sugary plant snacks. When you mow the grass, it releases jasmonic acid, among other things. It's sort of a signal to parasitic wasps that there is a caterpillar available. These creatures deal with the grass's offenders, and it can keep growing happily ever after. From the point of view of the grass, mowing is not much different from an insect attack, so it protects itself the best way it can. The rain has an easy-to-recognize powerful smell, also known as petrichor. But where does it come from? Turns out some plants secrete oils during drought. The rocks and soil accumulate those oils compounds, and when the raindrops hit, they mix with water and release into the air. Sometimes these oils combine with chemicals produced by bacteria living in the soil. The result of this cooperation is a musky odor you can smell in the woods or in your garden when you turn over the wet soil. Ozone also adds to the smell of rain, especially after thunderstorms. It happens when a lightning bolt's electrical charge splits oxygen and nitrogen molecules in the atmosphere, and they later recombine into ozone. One theory says we enjoy the aroma of rain so much because it's imprinted in our brains. Different cultures have always associated rain with something positive. and we could have inherited that perception. Now, chocolate fans, of which I am one, this is for you. There are flowers that smell exactly like your favorite tree. It's a product of a tropical plant after all, and since it's impossible to recreate the exact magical scent chocolate has in a perfume, you can plant some chocolate flowers, also known as the green eye lyra leaves, in your garden. These flowers look like daisies with yellow petals around a deep red center. When you pick its petals, the flower releases the delicious smell we all love so much. The leaves and branches of the plant also have the same fragrance. Now, in case I got you interested, you can find the flower in dry soils of Arizona, Texas, Colorado, and other states with similar climates. It blooms all year, and the aroma is strongest on warm days. The bear cat, also known as the biturong, does not only look super cute, but also smells like buttered popcorn. Biturongs prefer to stay alone and use their aroma to mark their territory and find potential partners when they have to. Scientists tried to figure out the secret of their unusual smell and suggested it could come from secretions from the scent glands under the animal's tail. Further research showed that the popcorn smell comes from the bear cat's urine. After the animal answers nature's call, it leaves a scent trail in the trees with its tail that often gets soaked. But if the real popcorn only releases its amazing smell when it's popping under heat, how do bear cats manage to do it without a microwave? Well, the answer could be in their diet, or more likely, in the bacteria that come in contact with the animal's natural fluid. Durian is a fruit popular in Southeast Asia that smells sweet and nice to some people, but to the majority, it's a mix of rotten onions and sweaty socks. The stench is so powerful that it's banned on public transportation and hotels in some countries. The secret of durian is its 44 odor-active components. The mix is so complex that you can never tell what it's going to smell like. And despite that horrible smell, durian is considered a delicacy and is used to make mostly sweet dishes like cakes and candy. There was a smelly incident involving durian at a library in Australia. The smell of rotting fruit in a cupboard has spread across the entire building through the air conditioning system. They mistook it for gas leakage and had to evacuate around 500 students and teachers. Well, that stinks. And finally, if you've ever been to natural hot springs or went to see some geysers, you'll never forget the smell of hydrogen sulfide, or less poetically, rotten eggs. It's actually not only yucky but also highly flammable, but it can also be quite useful. Most households in Iceland use geothermal springs as a source of hot water. Although it doesn't smell fresh, it's perfectly safe to drink, and the smell doesn't stay on your body after you take a shower. So there.
They said it was the most technologically advanced ship. They said it was unsinkable. And when it sank, they made a movie about it. These were the main reasons why the Titanic disaster became world famous. But unfortunately, this is not the only large-scale shipwreck. And sadly, there have been cases much worse than the tragedy of the Titanic. One of them occurred on April 27, 1865. The Sultana steamboat carried passengers and cargo daily between St. Louis and New Orleans. It was a pretty large wooden boat with 3 decks and was 260 feet long and 70 feet wide, almost twice the size of a basketball court. The ship could carry about 350 passengers, but on that unfortunate day, more than 2,000 people were on it. On April 23rd, she was making a routine voyage from New Orleans when it broke down. Something was wrong with the boiler, so the vessel docked in Vicksburg for repairs. At the port, the ship's captain, James Cass Mason, found out about an excellent opportunity to earn a lot of money. All he needed to do was to transfer a large group of former prisoners to the north. The captain agreed to do it, but the problem was that the boiler required a lot of time to repair. Mason was afraid that his competitors would take the job, so he decided to sail despite the malfunction the ship had. He patched up the holes in the boiler instead of a big repair and invited all the ex-prisoners on board. So, There was a broken boiler, an excess number of passengers, a lack of lifeboats, and not the best river conditions. Also, the captain refused to send the ex-prisoners to the hold, so they were all with ordinary passengers. There were strong chances for a shipwreck, but the greedy desire to earn more money was stronger. The Sultana went on a voyage and sailed up the river for 2 days. At this time, one of the biggest Mississippi floods in history began. The river overflowed its shores because of the flood, with the water level rising several feet. All the trees on the shore disappeared, and only the tops were sticking out of the water. The ship sailed opposite this powerful current, making the boiler work too hard. On the evening of April 26th, the Sultana arrived in Memphis, Tennessee, and they loaded even more, 120 tons of sugar and 200 passengers. She got incredibly heavy. Around midnight, the ship continued its dangerous journey. The captain sailed to barges to load a shipment of coal. At 1 a.m., the vessel left the barge. At 2 a.m., the broken boiler, unable to withstand the load, suddenly exploded. The Sultana was just 7 miles north of Memphis. Few people survived that day. The problem was that passengers trying to escape from the fire jumped into a cold river with a strong current. The Sultana disaster is considered the most tragic shipwreck in the history of the United States. The exact number of those who didn't survive is still unknown. According to various sources, this number was from 961 to 1,800 people. Don't be surprised that almost no one knows this story. There were many more survivors in the Titanic tragedy, and everybody heard about it. But the Sultana sank during one high-profile event. 12 days before the shipwreck, the country lost Abraham Lincoln. People hadn't yet recovered from this news, so no one paid much attention to the tragedy of the Sultana. Many catastrophes happened quite recently by historical standards. One of them occurred in 2002. The ferry La Jula was a Senegalese vessel. The ferry sailed twice a week, mainly along the coast of Dakar, carrying passengers who traded mango and palm oil. It made daily voyages and never faced severe problems thanks to modern rescue equipment and good repair service. But one day, the ship's crew discovered a malfunction and sent the boat to port. For almost a year, La Jula was in a non-working condition, awaiting repairs. But it didn't get high-quality service. After poor maintenance, the ferry set off on its last voyage. On September 26, 2002, La Jula sailed between southern Senegal and Dakar, and at 11 p.m. headed toward Gambia, where a strong storm began. The wind raised high waves, but this wasn't critical for the large passenger ship unless the number of people on board didn't exceed the established norm. La Jula was supposed to carry about 500 passengers, but had many more people that day. Too many passengers, poor repairs, and a strong storm caused severe problems for the ship. But the main factor in the shipwreck was that La Jula was only built for sailing in coastal waters, but that day, it sailed far from the shore. Big waves started rocking the boat, and at some point, it just turned upside down. The ship's deck went underwater, and its lower part stuck above the surface like an iceberg. All the passengers sitting in cabins fell on the ceiling and lost their orientation in space. There were no holes or damage in the ship's hull, and water flooded the lower decks for a long time. The vessel stood in a twisted position for several hours. Then, the boat began to sink when the water seeped through the deck and hold. The ocean was warm, but no one came to save the passengers. People had to wait almost 4 days to be rescued. Unfortunately, only a few managed to survive. The Philippines is a very dangerous area for ships. This place consists of several thousand islands and a vast area with shallow water. Ships can run aground and damage the hull with reefs and pitfalls. On September 20th, 1987, one of the most terrible disasters in navigation history occurred there. A Philippine passenger ferry called Dona Paz left one of the islands and sailed toward Manila. The sun was shining, the ocean was calm, and the visibility was good. But for some reason, the crew members didn't notice how the tanker Vector was approaching them. The two ships collided at low speed. The collision wasn't strong, but the problem was that the Vector had tons of oil on board, and the Dona Paz crashed into the cargo hold where that oil was stored. So it spilled all over the ocean, and then a spark slipped through. Not only did the two ships catch fire, but also filled with water. Both ships sank in a matter of seconds. Only a few dozen people survived that disaster. On September 27, 1854, the passenger ship Arctic sailed from Liverpool to New York. The fog came rolling down, and visibility got really bad. Another boat appeared out of the thick white haze, the French steamer Vesta. The ships were close enough to each other that a collision was inevitable. The French vessel was smaller, so it seemed to the Arctic's captain that Vesta had received a lot of damage. And while he was staring at the other ship, his boat got quickly filled with water. The captain gave the order to sail to the shore as fast as possible, but the ship's engines stopped working because of the flood. Then the ship's crew started to lower lifeboats with women and kids. Still, when rescuers found lifeboats with people, it turned out that only 87 out of 400 people survived, 65 crew members and 22 passengers. Surprisingly, there were only grown men among them. The ship's captain survived by clinging to the wreckage. All newspapers wrote about this story as one of the most terrible and shameful tragedies in navigation history. The survivors were criticized because they didn't save women and kids, and the crew members were accused of violating the law, since the safety of passengers should be higher than the safety of sailors. But despite this, none of them were brought to responsibility. Unfortunately, shipwrecks still occur to this day, but fortunately, there are fewer of them than before, thanks to modern navigation systems and radar. But no technology can guarantee there won't be a super strong storm or any other emergency that no one can foresee.
It was just a couple of hours before midnight. Some of the 2,200 passengers of a large, luxurious ocean liner were still partying in the beautiful first-class lounges. The rest were asleep in their beds, some of them in spacious cabins filled with paintings and decorated with ornate carvings, others in tiny rooms below sea level. All of these people had only one thing in common. On that chilly April night, all of them were heading from Southampton in England to New York City. The ship was called the Titanic, and at that time, it was considered unsinkable. At the very beginning of the journey, the liner nearly collided with the steamship New York. Luckily, the Titanic managed to pass by the other vessel with several feet to spare. A common sigh of relief escaped the passengers crowding the liner's decks. Little did they know what was awaiting them in the near future. Several days later, when the ship was already in the North Atlantic Ocean, 370 miles away from Newfoundland, the unthinkable happened. At about 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, those who were still awake were knocked over by some mysterious and powerful force. Passengers who were already in their beds got catapulted to the floor. Screams and total confusion. Months before the disaster struck, a ginormous chunk of ice had broken away from a glacier in southwest Greenland. It was made of the snow that had fallen about 100,000 years ago, when mammoths were still roaming the planet. When the iceberg just started its journey, it was a huge thing, almost 1,700 feet long. It also weighed 75 million tons. But then it floated much further to the south than normal, right into the area the Titanic had to cross on its way to North America. Even after melting into the water for months, the iceberg still weighed an impressive 1.5 million tons. Its top part was towering over the water for almost 100 feet. Even so, it looked harmless next to the massive ocean liner, but only at first glance. What people saw was just a tiny part of a jumbo piece of ice. The largest part of any iceberg is hidden under the surface, with a mere 1/10 visible above the water. The Titanic iceberg wasn't an exception. The moment the ship collided with it, the vessel was doomed. Unable to divert its course, it crashed into the ice, rupturing at least 5 of its hull compartments. They immediately started to fill with water, which then flooded each succeeding compartment. The front of the ship started to sink. This raised the back part almost vertically into the air, and then, with a deafening roar, the liner broke in half. The rest is history. But what if what we know about the disaster is not true? What if the ship hadn't been wrecked by an iceberg? What if it had been something more treacherous and way more alive that sank the Titanic? Far, far beneath the surface, in the ocean's dim, dark depths, a shadow lurks. Imagine an enormous creature, round, flat, and full of arms, or rather, powerful tentacles. It resembles a giant squid or octopus, but much, much bigger. Its descriptions go from as long as 10 ships to 1.5 miles long. Rumor has it unlucky sailors sometimes mistake the sea monster for an island, but instead of stepping on dry land, they're dragged down into the ocean. These people meet the Kraken, a legendary creature feared by everyone who sets off on a sea voyage. Usually, the Kraken haunts the seas off the coast of Norway through Iceland and all the way to Greenland. Who knows what has brought the beast further away from home? The waters of the North Atlantic are just as chilly, and the creature feels good and curious. Once it notices the Titanic, the ship has no chances to escape its attention. It's dark. That's why those on the ocean liner don't notice the first alarm bells. The water around the ship starts to bubble. If you strain your ears, you can hear bizarre gurgling sounds. If you strain your eyes, you can see thousands of fish and jellyfish rising to the surface. They feel something's up down below. But even if someone on the Titanic noticed this hectic activity, they wouldn't have time to get out of the way of the horrifying beast. Its enormous size and super long and strong tentacles turn it into a predator you can't escape. A 9-year-old boy standing on the deck knows nothing about the sea monster. He's just watching countless small islands rising out of the sea, very, very slowly. The kid doesn't understand why, but all the blood in his body suddenly runs cold. Hundreds of tiny fish are leaping about in the pools between these sandbanks, but soon they roll off into the water over the sides of the ginormous something. Several sharp points appear above the surface. The intrigued boy thinks they look like horns. They keep growing, thicker and thicker the higher they rise. Soon they're towering over the massive Titanic, dwarfing the ship. These horns are the Kraken's dreaded arms. The boy is paralyzed by fear, but then he spots the monster's eye. It's as big as an elephant. It makes the kid come to his senses and dash away, screaming like there's no tomorrow. The boy's shouting attracts people. They gather along the ship's side, trying to spot what scared the child so much. And then they see. First one, then more and more passengers and crew members lean over the railing to get a better look. They aren't being careless, they're just in shock. Indeed, it's hard to believe your eyes when they tell you a dreaded beast is about to attack the ship you're on. Plus, it's dark, and no one can see clearly what that huge shadow is. But the next several minutes prove it's not a mirage. All of a sudden, the creature rises one of its monstrous arms and stretches it toward the vessel. It might very well be longer than the liner's entire hull. Women start screaming and fainting. Men seem to be just as terrified. Those who have managed to keep their heads clear sweep up kids and run for shelter. That's when the first powerful hit shakes the vessel. The Kraken's had enough waiting. It's ready for action. Panic engulfs people on board the Titanic. Running around aimlessly and screaming, they create chaos that makes the beast even more interested. Normally, the monster just wants to be left alone. It rests deep down on the ocean floor, using its long tentacles to tether itself to the bottom and lazily hunt for food. It only rises to the surface when the weather's unusually warm, or when it gets disturbed. The Titanic is probably too massive and loud. It draws the creature out of its slumber. When the beast gets to the surface and sees a large, glistening boat, wow, the thing mesmerizes the creature. It holds out one of its tentacles to touch the unusual construction. The material is hard, and the beast wonders if the thing will break when squeezed. Without wasting much time, it wraps several arms around the ship and tries to squish it. Tiny creatures fussing around, falling overboard, and making annoying high-pitched noises start to irritate the Kraken. It's getting angry. Easing its grip, the monster circles the Titanic several times, getting ready for the next attack. This time, the strike is much stronger. It bends the metal and makes it brittle. One more movement of a deft tentacle, and the ship starts to fill with water. The Kraken retreats, as if to enjoy the results of its efforts. But then, it notices the ship trying to speed up in futile attempts to put some distance between itself and the monster. People on board the Titanic heave a sigh of relief. The beast is nowhere in sight. Little do they know that the Kraken never lets its toys get away. The ship is beginning to slow down. Its rear part is slowly lifting up, and the front is going down underwater. Passengers and crew members are falling over onto the decks. Most of them are too scared to make a sound. That's why everything's happening in almost complete eerie silence. Until the ship breaks into two parts under its own weight. The crash is so powerful that it scares away even the Kraken. Spooked, the beast dives back into the ocean, which creates a massive boiling whirlpool in that spot. The suction is dragging what's left of the Titanic to the depths of the ocean. The most tragic thing here, though, the Kraken isn't even interested in people on board the ship. This creature is content to munch on fish. It doesn't need bigger prey. It's the animal's curiosity that's now pulling the huge ship down to the bottom. Does the majestic liner have any hope? I think you know the answer. The Kraken is a colossal squid, a legendary sea monster, the biggest hunk of calamari you ever saw. And if this monster had existed, the world would have changed beyond recognition. The Kraken has powerful tentacles, solid muscles with suckers